Chapter 1491. The winter sun suddenly dimmed, and a whistle came from the top of the tree, as if countless birds were flapping their wings and flying high. The young hunter looked up subconsciously and saw countless silhouettes of light and shadow flying over his head. His mouth was wide open in shock. Flying horses? It's the Windrider colts. Those idiots are done for. Odom complained loudly, but I don't see anything. But they're in the sky. I don't know, I only see darkness. The dwarf replied in annoyance. The young man quickly adjusted the dwarf's heavy helmet. Odom cried out in surprise, Heavens, I didn't notice this problem. I was probably too anxious, thank you very much. Aha, idiot dwarf. Finny's teasing laughter could be heard from afar, and the elven girl was swaying back and forth in laughter. Ah, damn little girl. Odom was so angry that his beard was blowing. Just you wait, I'll teach you a lesson. Aha, you can't beat me, esteemed Mr. Odom. The young man carefully avoided the center of the two and raised his head to look at the battle in the sky. The Valkyrie's guard. Most of the people in Valhalla were hiding in their houses or temporary shelters. The workshops and shops on the streets were all closed, but everyone was hiding behind their doors and windows, silently watching this battle that would affect their future. However, the moment the female knights appeared on the tree canopy, a small cheer was set off behind the entire city. Shertu and Skager stood upright on their Valkyries' war horses that were burning with white flames. The spears in their hands flickered with the silver light of the poem, and behind their winged helmets, their long golden braids fluttered in the wind. They held small round shields in their hands, and behind them were hundreds of their sisters. They were the heroic spirit warriors from the ancient times, the Valkyries of Odin. Shida's cold eyes scanned the battlefield, and when she saw the horseshoe beetles charging towards her, a trace of disdain flashed in her eyes. Sisters. She pointed her spear at her opponents who were not in formation and shouted in a dignified voice, For Valhalla, for the Valkyrie, charge. Streaks of silver light poured down from the sky. Affected by Finny's premeditated use of slow and gravity, the beetle army was unable to organize an effective defense, not to mention that their individual strength was not superior to their opponents. In the era of the Queen Mother, the horned beetle was the most powerful existence in the Twilight Army, but that era was long gone along with the glorious era buried by the divine people. The Valkyrie's attack was like a sharp blade that pierced through the army. The horseshoe beetles fell like rain. Victory! The people in Valhalla screamed in excitement. The young hunter on the city wall was also screaming. He was cheering. Behind him, his father watched this scene silently, but there was a slight ripple in his heart. He couldn't help but recall his youth. At that time, Erwin still had two true heroes. Everyone had the hope of revival in their hearts. Under the leadership of the two lords, everything seemed to be so beautiful. The sweat on Barandal's face gathered into a stream, and the stream gathered into a small river. His face was as pale as a sheet of paper. He turned his head and looked at Hollis with pleading eyes, but the wizards didn't even look at him. Hollis was disappointed in this person. He didn't expect the horseshoe beetles to play any role now. The opponent had so many Valkyries, which was something they didn't expect in advance. More importantly, this fortress seemed to be intact. The colleagues who had been sent to carry out the destruction mission were probably dead. He didn't expect the battle to turn out like this. There was no doubt that this battle had fallen into a bitter struggle. The only advantage now was the Crystal Army on the ground. If the rumors were correct, the Tonajal people, whether it was the White Lion Guards, the Cavemen, or the Centaur Warriors, were far from being a match for the Crystal Army. He looked up. The canopy of Valhalla was slowly opening, and a huge spherical cavity appeared in the extended branches and leaves. The wind blew at the top of the tree, and thousands of sails flickered with sparkling silver light. That was the Tonajal's fleet. The fleet was so powerful that Hollis found it difficult to deal with. Its flagship used to be the main ship and command ship of the Kanaichi Air Fleet. The Kanaichi simply gave their backup fleet directly to the Tonajal people. This was the only force on the battlefield that could determine the outcome of the battle. It must be restricted. He snapped his fingers and a small magic circle appeared not far from him. A respectful voice came from the slowly rotating disc-shaped magic circle. Honorable Sir Hollis, Gonzalez awaits your orders. Order your fleet to spread out and seize the upper hand. Yes, sir. May the glory of knowledge be with you. Sir, bless us to defeat these country bumpkins easily. Please wait and see. Be careful. The opponent is not as weak as you think. I ask you not to take the initiative to attack. Try to contain the opponent within the effective range and expose the side of the Tonajal people. As you wish, sir. Only then did Hollis nod his head in satisfaction. Although the Banksians were also mortals, they had been willing to become vassals of the Sassalds for many years. It was much easier to use them than these barbarians. At least they understood the importance of obedience and discipline. The two large silver fleets in the sky were each looking for their best positions. The Sassalds' fleet clearly had the advantage. They arrived at the battlefield first and spread out first, while the Tanajal's fleet was still slowly forming out of the harbor. Hollis was suddenly startled. He saw the Tanajal's fleet actually attack in groups of 3, circling around the harbor like fish. This was the classic ground attack formation of the Bugha's naval tactics. They were clearly still within the attack range of his fleet, but they directly ignored the threat above them? Have the Tanajal people gone mad? This thought flashed through Hollis' mind. The next moment, the Tanajal's fleet opened fire. Magic and artillery shells swept across the battlefield like a hurricane, causing a devastating blow to the advancing army on the ground. Hundreds of crystal beasts were annihilated in this wave of fire. No. Baron Dahl's face was almost distorted. He rushed up and grabbed Hollis' arm. What are your fleet doing? Stop them. Hollis shook off the guy and directly fixed him in midair with a spell. Shut up, I know what to do, you damn idiot. In fact, there was no need for him to give the order. As an experienced captain, Gonzalez would never give up this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The Tanajal's fleet formed a flashing diamond in the sky. Their muzzles were almost all pointed to the ground. No one would be merciful to opponents who could not fight back. Open all the cannons. Let all the wizard apprentices on the deck. Gonzalez walked directly to the deck with a cigarette in his mouth and ordered the entire fleet through the magic communication array. He picked up his pocket watch and pointed at the ticking needle. I'll give you 3 minutes. Get ready to fire in 3 minutes. The Sassaldian fleet slowly turned, revealing an orderly battle line. Dozens of frigates followed the lead of the main battleships and turned to the side. The sailors opened the cannons one by one, revealing countless black holes. The magic cannons were being pushed up to their positions one by one, and the enchanted ballistae on the deck were also adjusted to their positions. Every magic array had a wizard ready for battle, and the crystal at the tip of their magic staffs was flashing with a dazzling light. Time's up. Fire. A cloud wall seemed to rise in the sky. Flames flickered between the clouds and countless artillery and magic suddenly broke through the rolling clouds, forming silver traces of light that connected to the Tanajal fleet that was constantly descending under the canopy of Valhalla. Then a deafening roar resounded through the sky. However, the artillery didn't hit the Tanajal fleet. A light green barrier slowly spread out from the canopy of Valhalla. Fortress defense system activated. Prepare to withstand the first wave of attack. Attack arrived. Energy returned to 13, 11, 12, 07, 11, 9, 10, 0%. Magic reaction complete. Recalculating damage report. A dazzling flash erupted from the light barrier, but after the explosion of magic and artillery, the smoke slowly dispersed. Valhalla stood majestically, and the silver fleet under its protection stood majestically. Haha, they aren't our match at all. Monica excitedly rolled around on the crystal control panel. She waved her fist at the calm girl and screamed, "You're amazing, Valhalla." The girl only expressionlessly sorted out Valhalla's damage report. It was a piece of snow-white paper. On the city wall, the youth's face was pale as he pressed his hand to his chest. However, at the last moment he let out a long sigh. This time he didn't scream, nor did he shout in excitement. He only calmly lowered his hands, and in his hands he clenched his fists. At that moment, something seemed to have appeared in the youth's heart. It was something he had never imagined in the past. He finally saw it. It was Erwin's power. In the air, the wizards were completely silent. The massive fleet of Sassaldians was also completely silent for a moment, to the extent where they even forgot to fire a second round. Hollis looked at this scene with a calm expression. He slowly extended his hand, and a red jade-like staff appeared out of thin air, appearing in his snow-white and slender palm. I should have known this would happen. This is the true power of the Holy War Fortress. He turned his head and his gaze swept past his colleagues. Follow me. It's time for us to take the field. Let the mortals witness the true power of Sassaldians. Chapter 1492. Silver doors of light opened above Valhalla, and Magi stepped out one after another, standing in the air with staffs in their hands, their long robes fluttering in the cold northern wind. Tisadormara. In the name of the stars. A wizard raised his staff high, the gem on the tip of the staff shining brightly. A silver beam shot out from the gem and shot in another direction. Nada's Vro. Lyra, one of the 12 witch constellations, the first wizard in the clockwise direction, also raised his staff, aiming the gem at the silver beam. The beam passed through the gem and was immediately deflected in another direction. One by one the wizards raised their staffs. In the sky, the red-robed secret walker of law, the blue-robed tower illusionist, and the gray-robed gray magician were all shining in different colors. Every time the silver beam passed through the staff of one of them, it would be refracted to another direction at an even faster speed, refracting again and again until it finally formed a circle that was constantly being divided. A huge circle that surrounded Valhalla. Hollis finally raised his staff, Griffin, and the silver beam passed through the dreamlike ring of azure tears on the tip of the staff, drawing the final stroke of the huge circle. He looked at the huge tree below with cold silver eyes, and slightly tilted the staff in his hand. Nadador Shlari, crown of the northern winds, Fishianra Tatori, scepter of the earth, flame, oath, vits, 4 elements, Tisadorli Aeri, guide of the stars. A bright beam of light shot out from the azure tears, pointing directly at the center of the huge circle. A huge silver rune appeared on the giant circle. Flame, flame. With it as the center, the silver halo suddenly expanded outwards, and countless mysterious runes naturally formed inside the ring. It was a magic circle. Then, 17 magic circles connected to it formed one after another. In the tree hall, the light spirits were already in a state of chaos. This is the end, he's too arrogant. Monica stuck out her tongue and threw herself onto the control panel. She slammed almost all of the crystals into the grooves and screamed, Valhalla. Warning, detecting a powerful magic ripple. Estimated to be activating the 3rd layer of shield. Target determined to be a flux magic elemental attack of the 13th rank. Magic ripple detected as meteor strike. The girl's calm voice resounded within the tree hall. Quick, calculate how much energy is left. Remaining energy, 11.3%. Estimated to be able to withstand attacks of level 11 or below. Lady Light Spirit slapped her forehead and said, I'm going to die. Hurry up and inform the Overlord. The north wind howled. The battlefield was silent. Whether it was the people of Tanajul, the nobles of the southern border, the knight, or the private soldiers, everyone stared at this scene in a daze. This kind of war had long exceeded their imagination. A second rune appeared in the sky. It was written with light, Earth, my lord. The knight turned around. Brando patted his young captain on the shoulder. He raised his head, and the silver network was reflected in his eyes. But what he saw was not the magic of the Sathard people, but the gray sky, the vast plains, and the wind that blew for thousands of miles. He closed his eyes and breathed in and out softly. What entered his lungs was the cold air, the breath of the biting north wind. It came from the distant Anzaruta Plateau, across the warm shining sea. The surface of the sea was sparkling, and under the sea, in the direction of the ocean currents, the Naga tribe was migrating south. It came here bringing news of the north. Brando saw all of this with his own eyes. His gaze seemed to penetrate the plains and mountains, through the sky and the earth. Everything in the wound was in his eyes. He breathed in and out. The wind on the battlefield suddenly stopped. The wind stilled and the falling snow also quieted down. People looked around in shock. In the woods on both sides of the wound, snowflakes fell quietly. The river water seemed to have lost its sound. Broken ice collided with each other on the surface of the water, and then was swallowed by the whirlpool. Every single needle drooped down silently. Crack! A crack appeared on the staff and Hollis raised his head in shock. He saw that the clouds in the gloomy sky were slowly flowing, and snowflakes were still falling. But at some point the wind of all things had stopped. At an altitude of thousands of meters, there was no wind flowing. This is... Brando opened his eyes and a nearly straight skyline was reflected in his dark brown eyes. He slowly turned over and dismounted his horse. He removed the holy sword of judgment from the saddle and slowly sheathed it. He raised the scabbard with a strap over his head and hung it behind his back. The young White Lion Knight, the Tanajul people, the nobles of Erewin's southern border, the knight and the private soldiers, and the people far and near on the battlefield were all watching his actions. Brando raised his head. The entire world had changed in his eyes. It no longer had mountains and rivers, flowing wind and water, fire and earth, and all elements and substances. The trees disappeared, the forest disappeared, the distant Greyhar Mountains disappeared, and the entire Tanajul disappeared. A world with countless silver lines intertwined and countless nodes connected together appeared in his eyes. This world no longer had any substantial power, but truth and law were everything in it. The domain of the sage. Brando took a step forward. The purple wave was silently approaching Valhalla. The walls of the fortress were already filled with tree elves and centaurs. Roland and little Montolo stood side by side, holding the swords that Brando had given them. They watched the scene nervously. Not far from them, Heinf took a deep breath. His hand was tightly clasped with the swordswoman. A third rune appeared in the sky. The wind of all things, the most unrestrained element in the world. Crack! Another sound of a staff breaking could be heard. Hollis turned around. This was like the source of a chain reaction. A series of cracking sounds could be heard, and he saw the staff breaking in the hands of his colleagues. The Cisaldians watched this scene in shock. They were almost unable to react. Time seemed to slow down at that moment. In the slowly flowing sequence of time, there was a loud bang. The third huge rune in the sky above Valhalla broke and disappeared. All the wizards spat out a mouthful of blood. They felt the wind element disappear at the same time. It was being pushed out of this land by an indescribable force. Heavens, what's going on? Someone is depriving us of our power. I can't feel the existence of the wind element. This is the direct rejection of the power of a higher level to the power of a lower level. There's a sage nearby. The wizards looked at the ashes of their staffs, their faces pale. They could not help but look around. However, Hollis's heart tightened. Be careful. He turned around and roared. There was a flash of light on the ground. There was a scream, and a long and narrow sword light intersected with a keeper of justice of the secret realm. That person's face showed a stunned expression. Then his head slowly drooped down until it fell from his neck. The headless corpse fell limply to the ground and soon became a tiny black dot. And in the place where he had been standing, a young man holding a sword appeared. The young man stood with his back to everyone. The holy sword was already in its scabbard on his back. The corners of his coat drooped motionlessly because there was no wind, and the hand holding the hilt had slender and powerful fingers. The knuckles were pale. It was quietly placed on the twisted and strange gauntlet of annihilation. Sage. Sage? Hollis squeezed these two words out from between his teeth. Brando shook his head and asked calmly, "What is power, Cisaldian?" Shameless boasting. 7 different magic circles suddenly unfolded behind Hollis. Imprisonment, gravity enhancement, slow movement prediction, law analysis, mind sensing, forbidden domain. 7 spells landed on Brando in succession. It was a pity that Brendel only needed to wave his hand and all of these spells fell apart. Hollis narrowed his eyes slightly, and a warning sign rose in his heart. He took a step back, but he could not move at all. The face of this most trusted assistant of Cisaldian wizard instantly turned snow-white. He immediately understood something. They were just one step behind him. The other wizards also began to cast their own spells. But before these people could complete their spells, they suddenly turned into balls of flames and fell from the clouds while screaming. This tragic scene actually caused everyone to stop moving out of fear. This is divine power? How is this possible? The gods have long passed away. They suddenly stopped talking. One by one, the Magi's faces turned pale. Brando did not speak again. He listened silently. There was no wind in the sky, but he seemed to hear a sound. It was a rumbling roar, echoing from the whole world as if the world was pulsating. Time after time, every beat was strong and powerful, like a forging hammer hitting his body, causing his blood to resonate as if it was boiling, making the same rumbling sound. Brando slowly turned around. The wizards could not help but hold their breaths because they first saw a pair of black eyes, but they gradually merged with the silver light, which seemed to be mixed with a wisp of golden brilliance. The golden brilliance became more and more intense, and finally completely enveloped Brando's vision. Hollis only felt his heart thumping, as if it would break free of the shackles of his chest and jump out of his chest at any time. Thump, thump, thump. The whole battlefield was shrouded in that huge roar. It was the powerful beating of the heart, but it did not belong to Hollis. It belonged to a great will. Bloodline reconstruction, fusion law, perfect body. Hollis felt that he must be going crazy. How could a mortal do this? How could a mortal break free from the shackles of the law of Tiamat after the era of the saints? How could a mere mortal cross the boundary between iron and silver and step into the realm of gold? That was the most powerful existence below the power of existence. He could not believe that he was able to witness the birth of a demigod with his own eyes. 10,000 years after the gods left the world. Such power had returned to this land once again. What was going on? Hollis watched as the young man turned around. With a light wave of his hand, the enormous silver formation above Valhalla shattered with a series of creaking noises. It was as if it had never existed. So, do you understand now? Brando said calmly, people who can't even hold on to themselves will never be able to understand the original meaning of this world, and the truth behind the law naturally has no fate with you. The Sasalds chose the path of destruction. He looked at the wizards with a cold gaze. What you are so proud of is nothing more than the madness before your destruction. No. Hollis shouted with all the strength in his body. But the raging flames had already gushed out from his body and burned him to ashes in an instant. Brando turned his head. Before the 32 Sasalds wizards could turn around, they had already been burned to ashes in the flames. Brando silently turned over his palm. Under his skin, faint golden veins of light were flowing. Chapter 1493. The front of Valhalla Fortress rumbled, and the battle on the ground finally broke out. The old dwarf Odin leaned against the battlements with one hand holding onto his dwarven helmet while the middle-aged hunter supported him from behind. He saw the purple crystals pouring down from the walls like a flood. Among those crystal monsters, a terrifying behemoth was ramming its head into a nearby tower, causing the entire city wall to tremble. Hurriedly, a loud voice cried out, "Stop!" The old dwarf hurriedly shouted, "Put me down. Those damn things are attacking us. Give me my hammer." The middle-aged hunter quickly let go of the dwarf. Odin jumped down from the battlements and tidied up his crooked armor. "Thank you very much. You're really strong." The middle-aged hunter returned the hammer to the dwarf and humbly replied, "It's nothing. The boars in the mountains are much heavier than you." Odin didn't find anything wrong with his words and nodded in satisfaction. "But can you change the way you carry me next time? No dwarf wants to be treated like a sack." Suddenly there was a scream from afar. The three of them turned around and saw 6 3-meter-tall insect-like crystals climbing up the walls. The centaur warriors in silver armor were retreating, and the elven archers shot out a wave of arrows. However, the enchanted arrows only made tinkling sounds when they landed on the crystal heads, and were bounced to the side. "Watch me!" Odin shouted and swung the hammer in his hand, throwing it at one of the monsters. The war hammer, engraved with silver runes on its surface, struck the crystal's head with a loud boom that sounded like a thunderclap. The monster screamed and a crack appeared on its head. It fell off the city wall. Odin waved his hand and the warhammer on the ground flew back into his hand. The old dwarf held the hammer firmly and shouted excitedly, "Have a taste of Master Odin's masterpiece, Storm's hammer." After saying that, he did the same thing and smashed the other crystal cluster with his hammer. At this time the elven archers finally reacted. Finny also opened her winged cloak and jumped, gliding to the top of the walls. She commanded loudly, "Change to resonance arrows." The wind archers took a step back and changed to the 4th set of enchantments. After a round of arrows, they finally knocked the 4 crystal beasts off the walls. "Haha." The dwarf couldn't help but laugh. "Looks like my old bones aren't as old as I thought." He even mocked Finny, "Looks like you tree thorns aren't that smart, huh?" But at this time, the sky darkened and the young hunter who was hiding at the side couldn't help but shout out a warning. "Be careful, Mr. Odin." Odin raised his head and saw a horseshoe beetle swooping down from the top of the tree, swinging its scythe-like blades at him. He couldn't dodge it, but an arrow hit the horseshoe beetle's compound eye, causing it to shriek and roll in the air. The giant scythe also brushed past the old dwarf's body, causing him to cry out in fear. Before he could finish, Finny had already rushed over and rolled him to the side. The horseshoe beetle that was rolling in the air swung its forelimbs, and a wind blade swept past the position where the two of them were just a moment ago, leaving a mark that was nearly half a meter deep. "Bah bah bah," the old dwarf spat out sand as he got up and said stubbornly, "Let me say this first, I won't thank you. I don't need an idiot's thanks. Enjoy your trip." "What?" Finny used her back to push against the battlements and kicked the old dwarf's butt, causing him to cry out in pain and roll down the walls like a wooden barrel filled with apples. At this time, the horseshoe beetle had already adjusted its posture and was once again charging in this direction. But Finny nimbly jumped to the side and used her wind cloak to jump to the other side of the tower. She raised her longbow and was about to counterattack when a blinding bolt of lightning shot out from the tower and hit the horseshoe beetle's head. Finny felt her body go limp as she fell into a person's warm embrace. She caught a whiff of an apple-like fragrance and looked up, only to see the red-haired girl catching her with one hand. Scarlet frowned slightly, holding the halberd in one hand as she charged towards the horseshoe beetle. The latter was hit by the lightning and lost its balance, falling shakily on the walls. Scarlet strode forward, the azure spear in her hand thrusting towards the monster like a bolt of lightning. After a loud crack, the horseshoe beetle was nailed to the top of the walls by her spear. "Miss Scarlet?" Finny cried out in shock. Only then did the Highlander girl put her down. She looked at her as if to make sure that she was not injured. I'm not injured," Finny replied with a red face, "but it's hard to say for poor Mr. Odom. Ah, damn it." The old dwarf was lying between a pile of smashed wooden barrels. Beside him was a pile of stinking salted fish. He groaned in pain. "Can't you send me down the stairs in a gentler way? This is already the most gentle." Finny pulled down her eyelids and made a face at him. The Grey Wolves mercenaries also came out from the tower. After Scarlet confirmed that Finny was fine, she turned to them and said, "You guys take Mr. Odom back to the second wall. Let's help too." The young hunter hurriedly said, "Although my father and I can't fight, we can still do what we can." Scarlet glanced at them. She was not familiar with the people of Valhalla, so she looked at Finny in confusion. She did not understand why there were 2 civilians on the walls at this time. "They're the 2 hunters, Miss Scarlet." Scarlet then understood. She did not answer the young man directly, but she still nodded at him. The group immediately got busy, but Finny was still puzzled. "Are we going to give up the first wall now? I think we can still hold on for a while." Scarlet nodded and took out a crystal ball from her pouch and held it in her hand. The crystal ball immediately emitted a faint radiance, and within the radiance was a projection of the situation outside of Valhalla. The angle of view was taken from the floating airship in the sky, and the projection was precisely the current battle situation in Valhalla. One could clearly see that on several sections of the city walls, the giant crystal siege beasts had already broken through the outer walls, and countless small crystal clusters were currently pouring into the first section of the city walls. The projection only lasted for a moment before it disappeared and was replaced by the figure of a little girl. Finny recognized the girl's identity. It was Sifrid. "Sifrid? It's me, Sister Finny. I'm currently in Odom Fortress. Can I entrust you with the task of retreating the wind archers to the second wall?" Phinia replied. Finny was stunned for a moment, but she immediately reacted, "Are we going to lure the monsters to the second tunnel?" She pursed her lips into a smile. "You're amazing, Sister Finny. That's exactly what I'm going to do." "All right, leave it to me, Sifrid." The elven girl's eyes curved into crescents as she smiled. She was a little excited in her heart. "Leave it to me, Sifrid." A resounding boom rang out as one of the crystalline beasts finally crashed through the tower. As it slowly and heavily stepped into the city, boundless purple waves had already gushed into the city through the hole in the city wall. "Retreat. Retreat quickly to the second wall. Move to the sides and leave a path in the middle." The knight sergeants on the walls immediately gave out orders, and the druids who were in charge of covering the crystal siege beasts cast thorns to slow them down. Roland and little Montolo were the last to jump off the walls. Before they left the defensive line, they took one last look outside the walls. They could only see a vast sea of purple. This was the fangs and claws of the Dusk Dragon. This was the legendary Dusk War. They never thought that the Count had been preparing for such a war all this time. Their hearts were heavy and uneasy, but they were also excited and their blood was boiling. This was the true hero of the Erewhon people. He was also the common hero of the mortals. When Roland thought of how he had almost wallowed in the mire with the Dusk Dragon's fangs and claws, he couldn't help but break out in cold sweat. He suddenly recalled the words that Brando had said to him. He understood that this was a test for him. If he had hesitated in the slightest, he would have already met the same fate as the nobles outside. Thinking of this, the youth couldn't help but tighten his grip on the sword in his hand. He wanted to use this battle to wash away the mistakes and humiliation he had to bear. However, before the two of them could express their feelings about the mission, they were kicked to the ground. They turned around and found that it was the lizard man who had been following them. "What are you doing?" Roland shouted in annoyance. Although they had noticed this lizard man who had been following Count Tonagel, they didn't think that he would dare to make a move against them. However, Ropar couldn't be bothered to talk nonsense with these two little fellows. He directly lifted them up, one in each hand. At this time, Roland and little Montolo felt that something was wrong. The other party had only casually grabbed them, but they couldn't avoid it. Roland couldn't help but be dumbfounded. Only now did he realize that there wasn't a simple person beside the Count. "Let us down." But being lifted like this was really a disgrace to a gentleman, so he couldn't help but protest. Ropar didn't care about this fellow at all. The soldiers on the first wall who hadn't retreated had already been completely submerged by the Crystal Cluster army. The position they were in now was actually already in danger. A crystal cluster pounced over. The Fireclaw Lizard Man Lord didn't even think before turning around and sweeping his tail over. A red light flashed on his body, and this tail attack actually shattered the crystal cluster into pieces. Elemental Realm. Roland couldn't help but cry out. But little Montolo knew more than him. His eyes almost popped out. Heavens, this is the peak of the law. Who is it? Then he immediately let out a scream. Those monsters are catching up. Roland turned his head to look behind him, and couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. At the gap in the wall behind them, there were 3 crystal cluster beasts that were at least 17 to 18 meters tall, slowly walking in this direction. The warehouses and barracks scattered along the way couldn't stop these huge monsters at all. Often they would collapse with a light touch. Amidst the flying dust, a sea of purple crystal clusters spread over the ruins of the buildings and flooded in their direction. But at this time Ropar stopped. Are you crazy? Hurry up and leave. Roland was scared silly by this scene and couldn't help but shout hysterically. He was prepared to fight for Erwin, but he wasn't prepared to die in front of these monsters. At least he wasn't mentally prepared to fight the Twilight Dragon. But his voice was drowned out by a huge roar. Not far away, the huge gate of Amu's fortress was slowly opening. Chapter 1494. Count Gonzalez frowned as he looked at the Nigel's floating fleet. The huge fleet had been acting strangely since the beginning. Although they still maintained the diamond formation, they had almost stopped delivering firepower to the ground. The other side was constantly rising in height, which was not a good sign for them. But Valhalla's magic shield still existed, and the Sisaldans could do nothing about it. Count Gonzalez paced anxiously on the deck of his ship until a messenger ran to him with a crystal ball in his hand and said, "Sir, Count Yinbao's contact." Gonzalez waved his hand angrily. "Tell him to go away. I don't have time to listen to him cry like a woman." He asked again, "Have you contacted Sir Hollis?" "No, sir." The messenger shook his head. "The magic circle above the Tonagel fortress has been maintained for several minutes, and no message has come." "What about the gargoyles sent out?" "They haven't come back, sir." Gonzalez turned his head, frowning as he paced back and forth beside his desk. Finally he stopped and said, "Let Barondale talk to me. I want to see what this guy is up to." The messenger immediately activated the crystal ball, and Barondale's anxious voice immediately came from the crystal ball. "Sir Gonzalez, great, I've finally contacted you. This is a great opportunity. I need the support of your fleet." "What did you say?" "My crystal army has already broken through the outer defense of the fortress. We are in the north of the fortress. You should be able to see the gap in that direction. My invincible army and I are preparing to launch an attack, but I need your help." "What kind of help do you need?" Gonzalez replied as he went to the porthole and looked down. The battle in Valhalla was obviously not as smooth as Dale had boasted. He saw that the torrent of crystal clusters had at most broken through the outer defense of the fortress. The firepower of the Tonagel fleet was very fierce, which caused great trouble for the battle on the ground. Presumably this was why Dale begged him for help. "Sir, what is that?" His messenger suddenly pointed in a direction and exclaimed. Gonzalez immediately looked in that direction. He narrowed his eyes and his expression changed. Barondale was still talking about his situation in the crystal ball, but the experienced captain interrupted him without hesitation. "I suggest you retreat quickly, Barondale." "What did you say?" "Your army that entered the city is finished. If you don't want to die, retreat quickly," Gonzalez repeated. "Are you crazy, Lord Gonzalez? No one in Trentheim can pose a threat to us except for their earl." Barondale's voice shrieked. "Just think of me as crazy, Barondale. This is my last advice to you." He gestured for the messenger to close the communication crystal ball. The bridge fell silent. Gonzalez was silent for a moment. He rested his chin on his hand and thought. Then he flipped his pipe and tapped it on the corner of the desk. "The Tonagel fleet is acting strangely, my lord." At this time, the voice of the first mate was suddenly transmitted to the captain's room through the microphone. Gonzalez was startled and subconsciously rushed to the porthole, but his messenger had already shouted, "The tree's defensive barrier has disappeared." Sure enough, he saw through the glass of the porthole that the hemispherical defensive barrier covering the fortress faintly disappeared after a few flashes. At this time the Tonagel fleet was regrouping. They slowly formed a beautiful battle line and turned their sides to face the Sisaldian fleet. "We are faster than them." Faced with this scene, Gonzalez's mind flashed like a bolt of lightning. He calculated the time difference almost instantly. He shouted into the microphone, "Prepare to fire immediately. The entire fleet will accelerate and change course. Seize the upper hand." However, due to a strange combination of factors, Count Gonzalez raised his head at this time. He suddenly realized that the huge magic circle above Valhalla had disappeared. An uneasy thought flashed through Bansia's mind. The giant gates of ORM's fortress were slowly opening. The Crystal Cluster army had already charged in front of Rolinti's group. One of the fastest insect-shaped crystal clusters had already spread its wings, flying towards them from a dozen meters away. Little Montolo, who was being carried by Ropar, couldn't help but scream in fright, but the Fireclaw Lizard Man Lord didn't move at all. Gotcha. Just as Rolinti thought that he was dead for sure and couldn't help but close his eyes, a clear sound came from above his head. The youth couldn't help but open his eyes in fright, only to discover that the crystal cluster that had pounced towards them had already been split in two. A large head stretched out from behind them. It was like a long snake's head. It waved its neck in the air and accurately bit down on the crystal cluster, its sharp teeth splitting it in two in an instant. Following that, a second, third and fourth head appeared in Roland's vision one after another. Roland opened his mouth wide, only to hear little Montoro shrieking like a madman beside him. Multi-headed basilisk. To be precise, it was a 9-headed basilisk. In terms of bear lineage, it was second only to the 12-headed basilisk. It appeared behind the gates of ORM's fortress with rumbling steps. When it fully extended its 9 heads, its total height had already surpassed the second wall of Valhalla. It was a giant beast that was more than 50 feet tall. Ropar didn't move at all, allowing the giant beast to trample past him. It was like a meat grinder as it slaughtered its way into the Crystal Cluster army. Its 9 heads moved together, and the Crystal Cluster army was instantly thrown into disarray. The Serpentine Lizard's powerful defensive ability was fully displayed at this moment. Although the crystal clusters could occasionally break its outer skin and cause damage to it, the wounds were often healed almost instantly. Sometimes even the blood did not have time to ooze out. The 3 crystal cluster beasts finally arrived in front of the 9-headed basilisk, but they were now a size smaller than the 9-headed basilisk. Moreover, as a superior magical beast, the 9-headed basilisk's intelligence was much higher than the crystal clusters that didn't have the ability to think on their own. It directly used its huge body to crash into one of the crystal cluster beasts, knocking it to the side. When the other crystal cluster beasts pounced at it, it used its other 5 heads to spit out lightning and acid rain, forcing it to retreat. The 4 crystal cluster beasts quickly clashed together. This was a nightmare for the smaller crystal clusters. Fortunately, they didn't have the ability to think on their own, so they didn't have any unnecessary fear. Otherwise, they would have been defeated long ago. Do your best. Little Montolo was clearly scared to death before, but now he was so excited that he screamed, "Kill that damned crystal cluster beasts." However, Rolinti had already reacted. If the Count's subordinates were here, then there wouldn't be only one 9-headed basilisk in this fortress. He turned around and sure enough he heard a young girl's cold voice. "Everyone attack." A rumbling sound echoed in Luo Lin's ears. What the hell is that? Baron Dahl, who had just joined up with his Yenbao army, witnessed this scene with his own eyes. He only saw the Crystal Cluster army pouring into Valhalla from the gap in the city wall, but within a quarter of an hour, the purple torrent retreated from the original path. It wasn't because of failure that they retreated. For the Crystal Clusters, there was no such word as retreating in their dictionary, but they were almost directly driven out of Valhalla. In front of them were dozens of giant lizards that stood out from the crowd. Baron Dahl almost blacked out when he saw the multiple heads on their necks. Multi-headed basilisk. Why did the Tonajal people have this kind of thing? Although the crystal clusters were still far more than the 9-headed serpent lizard in terms of quantity, the superior individuals in the crystal clusters were not inferior to these high-level magical beasts. In fact, the strength of the Lord-level crystal clusters far exceeded that of the 9-headed serpent lizard. However, Baron Dahl couldn't command the Lord-level crystal clusters. What's more, the artillery fire of the Tonajal fleet was constantly covering the front of the position, especially for those large targets. Few could break through the barrage and rush to the front of the Tonajal people. Baron Dahl was really fed up with the lack of air superiority. Although he clearly had the support of the Sisaldian fleet, this support was no different from not having it. Not to mention that the other party had previously rejected his request to directly bombard Valhalla fortress. These damned Banksians. Baron Dahl couldn't help but gnash his teeth and shout, "These damn Bugas, one day they will pay for their arrogance." He spurred his horse forward, raised his sword, and shouted to his subordinates, Now, it's time for us to be loyal to our supreme master. In front of him was a dark army, almost everyone was wearing armor. This elite army was originally composed of the Yenbao Knight Regiment. They were originally loyal to Count Yenbao. But at this moment, it was an army that belonged to him alone. What's more, they were no longer those weak human knight. Don't be afraid of death, Baron Dahl screamed like a madman, because we are invincible, no one in this world can really hurt us. He pulled out a dagger and stabbed it into his left shoulder, but not only was there no drop of blood, when he pulled out the dagger, the silver gap left there was slowly healing. We are immortal, we are the best warriors under the rule of our supreme master. We are. Baron Dahl grasped the reins tightly and turned his mount around. Then he pointed his sword at Valhalla Fortress and said, "Warriors of the No Race, charge with me and respond to the supreme call." His crazy behavior seemed to have inspired others, and the knight army that came to Yenbao also became fanatical. They let out a fanatical scream, and the battlefield was immediately filled with people shouting and horses neighing. Charge! Kill! In the Hall of Trees, the previous busy scene had gradually subsided. The calm-looking girl was reporting the loss in a calm voice, and when she finally said, "The magic transmission has been disconnected, and Valhalla's magic shield has begun to shut down," Monica suddenly interrupted her. "Wait, Valhalla," Monica pointed to a scene on the crystal tower and said, "Zoom in here." The girl did as she was told. That was the image that Baron Dahl encouraged to his men. "Humph, it's the No Race." After Monica saw the scene there clearly, she couldn't help but reply contemptuously, "These idiots really came. What invincible. Boasting shamelessly." She turned her head and said to the girl, "Valhalla, help me contact Miss Andrea, where are they?" "We're in Zone 5, Miss Monica." Before the light spirit could finish her sentence, Andrea's voice came from the crystal tower. "My sisters and I are ready." Hee, those bastards probably thought that our legacy was lost outside the elemental frontier. "I'll show them what I'm made of." "Zone 5, very good," Monica shouted excitedly. She waved her fist and said, "Andrea, show those country bumpkins what you're made of." Then she turned her head again and shouted to Valhalla, "Valhalla, quick! Open the entrance to Area 5. The battlefield seemed to be quiet all of a sudden. Baron Dahl felt a little strange. The Tanajal's fleet suddenly gave up suppressing the ground's firepower, but they didn't seem to be fighting with the Sisaldians' fleet. Because the rumbling sound of cannons in the air disappeared, and the explosion of magic no longer appeared, as if the two fleets had suddenly withdrawn from the battlefield. He wanted to look up to see what was happening in the sky, but he didn't have the chance because he and his army had already entered the range of Valhalla Fortress. He could only see layers of huge treetops above his head. What's more, the gap in the wall was right in front of them, and they were about to fight with those multi-headed lizards. If it was before, even if he was given 100 guts, he wouldn't dare to attack such a rank 7 or 8 demonic beast head-on. But at this moment, the Supreme Master had already given him an unparalleled power. Perhaps it wasn't strong enough, but it was an eternal and indestructible power. It was the power he dreamed of. Adrenaline was secreted at an accelerated rate, and he was so excited that he almost flew. War and killing turned out to be such a pleasant thing. If it weren't for the Supreme Master, he might not have been able to play such a game of life and death in his life. He looked up as if he was trying to find the enemy from his shrinking pupils. But it was at this moment that he froze. He found that the multi-headed lizards were slowly retreating in an orderly manner. Obviously their beast tamer was extremely brilliant. But this was not the point. The point was that he saw a silver light spot flying from a distance. Baron Dahl's face suddenly changed. "Goddess of War!" He screamed wildly, "This is impossible." Chapter 1495. The Sisaldian fleet in the sky had been silent for a long time. Apart from the purple waves on the ground that were still sweeping towards Valhalla, the battle in the sky had sunk into a strange silence. The Sisaldian floating ships that flickered with silver light hovered in the air. The attacks had stopped as if time had stopped. Their opponents, the Tanajal fleet, were turning around. The huge silver fleet directly exposed their flanks to the Sisaldians, and their cannons were facing the ground. This seemingly strange scene was actually playing out in front of everyone at this moment. What's going on? The main offensive on the battlefield was being led by the Crystal Cluster army, but the allied noble army that had not gone far was now in a perplexed state. The continuous changes on the battlefield caught them off guard. For a moment, they could not even tell which side was their ally and which side was their enemy. The allied noble army's reaction was slow. Time continued to pass minute by minute. In the captain's room of the Sisaldian flagship, the St. Patcher, the atmosphere was even more bizarre than on the battlefield. Facing the young man in front of him, Gonzalez suddenly understood that he might have had to make such a choice. Perhaps he should have understood it long ago. When the other party suddenly appeared in front of them with the staff, Tographin, he should have understood everything. The captain's room was silent. It was hard to imagine that there had been an endless stream of people here just a moment ago. Messengers and officers of all kinds came in and out, and cartographers were constantly changing the markings on the map. The clamor of commands and announcements was like a market. You can choose death. Brando calmly looked around. The 13 high-ranking Cisaldian officers subconsciously shrank back under his gaze. Only the red-robed archmage on the ship glared at him, his eyes spitting fire. He let go of his hand and let Archmage Hollis' staff hover in the air. More than a dozen pairs of eyes fell on the staff. And let your fleet be buried with you. How can a mortal like you resist the great Cisaldian fleet? The red-robed magus bellowed and pointed his staff at Brando. The crystal at the tip of the staff immediately radiated a bright light. But before he could cast his spell, Brando had already pointed at him lightly. The power of space seemed to lock the old mage tightly, choking his lips and tongue, making him unable to move or say a word. Brando looked at the man indifferently. Only the people of the sky are high and mighty, because they are born with a special privilege different from mortals. Even though you've fallen into the mortal world today, you're still unwilling to give up your arrogance. You can start wars, you can control the fate of mortal kingdoms, but do you think that the Cisaldians are not responsible for all that they have done? He shook his head and smiled contemptuously. Naive. Don't be complacent too early, Erwin. You destroyed the fleet of the people of the sky, and this matter will never end. The old magus suddenly coughed up a mouthful of blood, as if he had broken free from the restraints of space. He shouted at Brando at the top of his lungs. Brando did not look at him. His gaze fell on the others. In the captain's room, other than the arrogant Cisaldian magus, no one dared to look him in the eye. Even the middle-aged noble, who was obviously the commander of these people, subconsciously remained silent and lowered his head. I never said that this matter would end here. His gaze fell back on the unruly old magus, and there was an unprecedented coldness. This was supposed to be a pointless war. However, those who shouldn't have fallen in this war had made unnecessary sacrifices for it. Iko and his wife. The king's eldest son. Ura, who was seriously injured. Amandina, whose life and death were unknown. And the eldest princess and her brother, and Freya, who had disappeared without a trace. All of this should belong to this damned war and to the culprits who started this war. When he thought of the upheaval in Lantern Island and the death of Iko and his wife, Brando felt a piercing pain in his heart. He even remembered that before he left Erwin, he had deliberately reminded the couple to pay attention to their own itinerary. The tragic script of history should have been avoided. Everything in Erwin should have been progressing on the positive side. But a moment of negligence led to such a bitter outcome. Perhaps he could have been more careful. More decisive. If he had ended the chaos in Erwin earlier before all this happened. He had the support of the eldest princess, and he had Lantern Island and Vero as allies. Even the Highland Knights were kind to him, and as an indispensable part of the kingdom's political landscape, the royal faction was willing to reconcile with him. As long as he was willing. He could have rebuilt the former alliance of the nobles, single-handedly ended the chaos between the north and the south, and let Erwin return to prosperity and unity. Perhaps in that case all of this should not have happened. But, was it really so? It was a happy and harmonious Aween, where everyone seemed to have gotten what they wanted from Erek's corpse. It was a flourishing Aween, where everyone seemed to have obtained enough benefits from the carcass. Was that his ultimate purpose for returning to this era? No. Brando shook his head firmly in his heart. The future Erwin should not be just like this. Perhaps he still had ideals in his heart, perhaps the eldest princess was strong enough, perhaps the royal faction was still willing to keep their promises. But they were not Erwin. Just as the late King Iko swore under his sword, I swear under this sword the sage's oath, I swear to lead my people, to lead them away from strife and slaughter, away from the arrogance and greed of the empire's nobles. I swear to not repeat this cold-blooded mistake of history. I will let the nobles of this new kingdom follow the spirit of the knight, fair and strict, upright and brave, merciful and generous. I swear this oath, and I will abide by it for the rest of my life. That sonorous and powerful voice still reverberated in an era like today's. Erwin's glory was destined to belong to such a revolutionary era. She would get rid of all the old things. Her successors would be fair and strict, upright and brave, merciful and generous. Those young people would inherit the glory of the past and be honored enough to take over the sacred flag. They would not be the royal faction, because the old nobles would never be able to bear such glory. He knew that Her Highness would eventually understand all of this. It was just like the truth that she finally understood in the end of history, because she and them were destined to be different people. Once all of this came too late. But today perhaps there were different variables from the beginning. This is the value of my existence here. Brando raised his head and looked at the old wizard with a twisted face. As if the natural opposition of the new and the old order, the two looked at each other indifferently. I will achieve all of this, and anyone who stands in my way, no matter who he is, will be reduced to ashes. Ha ha. The old wizard breathed heavily and looked at the young man Erwin, who was talking to himself like a madman. Just like how mortals can never understand the vastness of the sky, it seems that a moment of luck has made you start to get delusional. You don't understand the power of the Buga people at all. You don't understand my power either. Brando replied coldly. He turned back again and looked at the others in the captain's room with some indifference. The Sasaldians are high and mighty, but you should understand that you are not the ones high and mighty. And as slaves, do you also want to share the last glory of your master? Even die for them, but God knows how important your sacrifice will be in their minds? No one spoke. Not far from the drawing table was a display of clocks. In the silent room, there was only the monotonous ticking of the hands for a moment. The red-robed wizard of the Sasaldians was also arrogant. He allowed Brando to encourage his former subordinates in front of him, but he did not say a word and just watched the scene indifferently. The staff floating in the middle of the cabin made him realize the failure of this trip. But how could the Sasaldians be afraid of failure? Not to mention losing to mortals. The pride of the people of the sky came from the power they had mastered for generations. Such power within the territory they could reach was the eternal truth. Everyone knew what would happen to them if they refused. The terrible young man in front of them killed everyone, including the great wizard Hollis, and even brought back his staff Tographin. He was a godlike figure that they could only look up to. However, on this unknown battlefield he turned into the dust of history. Everyone subconsciously swallowed a mouthful of saliva. The respected officers looked at each other and looked at each other. In the end, everyone's gaze fell on Gonzalez. Count Shiva coughed bitterly and stood up from his seat. His figure was obviously dejected. I admit the victory of Erwin's people. I hope my colleagues and I can at least enjoy the last bit of dignity. This was a surrender. But Brando shook his head. Under everyone's gaze he slowly opened his mouth and said, I think everyone is mistaken about one thing. This is not the battlefield of the human countries. Please take a good look outside the porthole and see who your enemy is. This is a war. It has never started and perhaps it will never end. Gentlemen, you and I have heard all the legends about it. Every time this happens as the people of Martha, shouldn't we stand together and fight side by side? Please ask yourselves, who is your enemy? What should you protect? Do you want to continue helping the evildoers and destroy all hope with your own hands? Let this world turn into ashes? Is this what you want? This is the Holy War. It is the final battle between order and civilization. Gentlemen, you should understand that the people of Sassold are not Erwin's people, but you. Brando grabbed the staff Tographin and threw it forward. The silver staff fell on the deck and rolled to Gonzalez's feet. Sir Commander, give the order to mobilize your fleet. I, Count Tonagel, represent Erwin's people and ask the Banksians for help. If you still remember the sacred oath, please turn your warriors around and let us fight for victory together. Sir, Gonzalez was stunned for a moment. The fleet commander with graying sideburns subconsciously turned around and glanced at his colleagues one by one. At this moment, perhaps they did not dare to forget the oath. Perhaps they could not forget the oath. But the time when the various countries of the world fought side by side and abandoned all prejudices for a common goal seemed very, very long ago. It was so far away that it seemed like a legend. Remember the oath of the past? No matter how dark and depraved it was. But those who rose up to resist had won in the end. Count Tonagel never thought that his voice would be so hoarse and dry. We understand. Thank you, sir. Brando waved his hand. He took one last look at the red-robed wizard who was fixed in midair, as if he was looking at a dead fish. Then he turned and walked out of the captain's room. Everything was far away. The darkness was still filled with the sounds of footsteps and splashing water. It was filled with the smell of blood flowing like a river. There were distant and hoarse howls. There was the loud sound of a huge object being overturned. Trees were burning, and when the bark peeled off, there was the crisp sound of death. The distant and ancient legend still continued to this day. In the darkness he seemed to see a picture scroll. The raging flames reflected the whole sky. In the dark night, there were golden red clouds and a rain of fire was falling from the sky. A huge incomplete moon stared at the cracked land behind the clouds. Lava spread out from under the surface. On the vast battlefield, the giants shining with the light of stars were engaged in a final battle with their enemies. The giant's father was bitten on the ankle by the giant wolf Fenrir, and a black shadow suddenly shrouded the pale moon. The giant's children fled in all directions, and a tall figure holding a giant spear came in front of the dying giant. Countless voices screamed as if it was a picture of the end of the world. The burning spear pierced into the giant's father's chest. "We should have won." The heavy footsteps suddenly stopped. Before the weak consciousness finally dissipated, Andrea silently looked at the middle-aged human male's corpse in front of her. Barandal's empty eyes looked at the sky, as if there was still the last despair and unwillingness in his eyes. He, or this creature that should no longer be called a human, had an inhuman silver-gray face. Disgusting crystal tumors grew on the loose skin of his face. This terrible monster still maintained the state of the last moment before its death. The horror of that moment still remained on its face. It opened its mouth wide, but it couldn't make the last sound from its throat. Because a light spear had pierced its chest from the front to the back, fixing its decaying corpse on the ground at a certain angle to its body. The young girl lowered her head and watched this scene. Her beautiful face under the silver mask seemed a little indifferent. Rather than saying that she was looking at the things in front of her, it would be better to say that her gaze was lingering in a distant memory. In a loud bang, the burning tree trunk in the distance was falling. The final attack of the Crystal Cluster army arrived in front of the third line of defense in Valhalla. Countless roaring flames and fireworks were rising from the purple sea. Then a tsunami of cheers broke out behind her. In the sky, both the Tanajal and Sisaldian fleets were slowly turning around and neatly forming a battle line. The two fleets were converging. That was the last place the Crystal Cluster army could reach. Even without looking back, Andrea knew that the Twilight army was beginning to retreat. Her cloak fluttered slightly, and the broken cloth seemed to be able to brush across the entire battlefield. They were the shadows of the earth, the nightmare of the gods. But they were not without enemies. "And us," Andrea said softly. She raised her head and looked into the distance. "And them we can defeat your master. What the Twilight Dragon gave you is just a dream. Victory is not far away." As she spoke, the girl slowly reached out, held her spear and pulled it back. The Baron's corpse, which had lost all signs of life, emitted a crisp sound from his chest. His entire body slowly fell forward to the ground. His corpse slowly melted, flowing on the ground like mercury. Then it dried up and turned into silver powder. It was swept up by a whirlwind and scattered in the wind. The No race. The Twilight race was born from magic. As long as the energy was not extinguished, they would continue to multiply. In the war of the past they had once destroyed the kingdom of the giants. However, in this never-ending war they also had such an old enemy. Chapter 1496. Let's rewind time a few minutes ago. On the huge battlefield surrounding the World Tree Fortress. On both sides of the Paris Valley, there was a drastic change happening on the plains. Just as the war goddesses flashing with silver light crossed the sky and cut straight into the Yenbao army led by Baron Dahl. Looking from the entire battlefield, the battle seemed to have reached its most intense moment. The purple crystal tide was surging to every section of the wall within sight of the huge fortress. In the sea of purple light shining with ominous purple light, the flags that symbolized the humans and elves of Erewhon were constantly submerged and fell. But occasionally they would appear again. They symbolized the unyielding resistance of the Tanajal and the druids and elves in the Black Forest. The earth-shattering battle cries converged into an invisible wall, blocking the advance of the Twilight army. Just as Monica had predicted, the scales of victory on the battlefield were tilting, but not to the side of civilization. The situation was uncontrollably sliding into the worst situation. Facing the endless Crystal Army, the defense line of this legendary fortress was gradually becoming precarious. The carrier of the soul of the newborn Valhalla, the expressionless girl, was observing the situation of the entire battlefield through her branches and displayed the details on the huge crystal facade in the tree hall. At the same time, she analyzed the gains and losses on the battlefield emotionlessly in her heart, and then told Monica, "How much time is left before the last defense line?" I know. Monica shouted impatiently while scratching her hair in annoyance. Although they were just bright beams of light, they did not have a physical body. She muttered and jumped down from the crystal tower, flying through the skylight of the dome of the hall. Passing through the shadow of Valhalla, there was the blue sky. The light spirit raised her head toward the sky and muttered to herself, "Don't let us down." Such a scene was reflected in her magnificent eyes. The towering canopy of the world tree had endless green shadows that shrouded almost the entire sky. The green leaves swayed in the wind. And at some point, the huge magic circle that was forming above Valhalla had long disappeared without a trace. Where did the Sisaldian wizards go? The noble armies on both sides of the river valley no longer had the time to consider this problem. This was because the battle was gradually getting out of their control, and those who were originally participating in the battle had now become bystanders. After tasting defeat, the noble knight led a large number of their attendants back to the north bank of Welland Ferry. At this time no one was chasing them from behind. The Tanajul army had already passed them and collided with the Crystal army on the distant plains. That was a bitter and tragic battle. Everyone looked at this scene with lingering fear. They seemed to have seen such a scene when they were children. In myths and legends, in stories and dreams, the prophecy about the fate of the world that the wet nurse told them by the bedside, the engraving on the pale poem, about the moment when the people of Martha, the civilization of the world, met the ultimate enemy of this world. Dusk of the gods. In that case, who was the enemy of whom? What was everyone fighting for in this place? Was this just a civil war in a small kingdom? Why did it become like this? Those northern knights who had experienced or were experiencing this war were the first to feel confusion and fear. The development of things was beyond their understanding. The beliefs and values they had pursued all their lives, the question of who was the rightful ruler of the kingdom, seemed to have become insignificant at this moment. However, before the northern nobles could recover from the great shock, the defeated army on the plains had already rushed over. When the Dusk army appeared, the first to become their target was actually not the Tanajul army, nor was it even the most obvious target on the battlefield, the World Tree Fortress. Instead, it was the army of the northern nobles who were closest to the portal from the beginning. For the crystal and the insects, these humans were not allies in their eyes. They did not have this concept in their consciousness. Their choice was to follow their instincts and attack these creatures of order closest to them. Or rather, it was a massacre. The sudden attack from behind and the great sense of disillusionment of being betrayed by the royal faction and Count Yenbao instantly caused the Northern Noble Alliance to collapse. This collapse caused an even wider chain reaction. On both sides of the Ord River, many noble knights who had just reorganized their army and gathered the courage to return began to turn around and flee. Looking from the entire battlefield from afar, it was as if a terrible defeat had occurred. This was indeed a complete defeat. However, not all of Erwin's people fled. On the battlefield, another group of Erwin's people were defending their glory. These guys really fled. Little Montolo was covered in blood and half kneeling on the ground, using the magic sword that Brando gave him to support himself on the ground as he gasped for breath. His face was full of contempt as he spat. "I thought they would at least have some courage and understand who the real enemy is. This can't be entirely their fault." Roland leaned on the huge roots of Valhalla and witnessed this scene. At this time he could not help but think of his own position. Not long ago he actually had no right to laugh at these people. However, he did not expect that the royal faction and Count Yenbao would have such a side. And his family, his father, did they really understand all of this? "They just chose the wrong people," Roland muttered. "Among Erwin's people, there is no lack of brave people. For example, you, Roland? No, I am much luckier than them, at least for now." Even though he said so, Roland's tone was still filled with great disappointment. There was nothing more depressing than watching all the hope that you worked so hard for shatter. Needless to say, from the very beginning, he had been walking on the wrong path. However, a true man would not be discouraged and give up because of this little setback. As one of the most outstanding figures of the younger generation in the southern border, Roland only recovered after a short moment of self-blame. He picked up his sword and stood up with the help of Valhalla's tree wall. "No need to be emotional, little Montolo, there is not much time left. The victor between us has not been decided yet. I just killed a small crystal worm, now we are even." "What?" Little Montolo was shocked. "The situation is already so bad? I thought we could still hold on for a while." "No, you're mistaken. What I'm saying is that your count may be about to win this decisive battle." "Are you crazy, Roland?" Little Montolo raised his head in surprise. He could not see any signs of victory on the battlefield. But Roland shook his head. I am not crazy. In terms of talent and swordsmanship, I may not be as good as you, but in terms of foresight on the battlefield, you are still far behind, little Montolo. I don't believe it. You don't have to comfort me, little Montolo replied unconvinced. At least in this battle, I am ready to die for my country. Then you should save your life for later. Roland raised his head and stared at the sky of the battlefield. Yinbao has already lost the last chance to win. Under his gaze, the silver brilliance that symbolized the goddess of war cut into the army led by Baron Dahl. That is Lady Andrea, little Montolo exclaimed. But then he saw an even more incredible scene. The specks of Cisaldian magi in the sky above the battlefield fell one after another, falling into a sea of amethysts and never rising again. What was going on? Little Montolo's eyes widened, and his mind was full of question marks. A calm voice answered his question. The silver folk are not the real people of God. The Cisaldian apprentice wizards are the same as mortals. Before they really touch the realm of truth and law, they can't use spells to stay in the air for long periods of time on the battlefield. Roland and little Montolo turned around and saw that the pair of elven sisters had appeared behind them at some point. A tiny fairy was sitting on the younger sister's shoulder, but it wasn't the light spirit that had received them in the fortress. It was a fire fairy. The magic energy that pervaded the entire battlefield disappeared, and the Cisaldian fleet withdrew their support. So these poor guys finally have a taste of their own medicine. The fire fairy, or rather, the prince of the fire elemental fairies, Lute answered coldly. A fleet? Roland replied thoughtfully. Little Montolo was about to ask who this strange little guy was, but it was at this moment that a wave of cheers interrupted his thoughts. He turned his head subconsciously. At this moment, the two fleets that were still in the sky finally moved. As if they had a premonition, the sea of crystals on the battlefield began to stir. Under little Montolo's surprised gaze, they began to retreat wave by wave. At that moment, the young man seemed to realize something in his heart. That thought was like a beam of light piercing through the darkness, shining straight into the depths of his heart. The Cisaldians had failed. They had won the battle in the sky. The Count had once again demonstrated his ability to create miracles. The army of Dusk had lost absolute air supremacy on the battlefield at this moment. As if confirming his thoughts, the horseshoe insect army that had been circling above Valhalla Fortress suddenly flew up with a hum, welcoming the two fleets in the air. Everyone on the fortress felt the pressure suddenly lighten. The elven archers that had been fighting desperately against the enemies in the sky even fell into a daze for a moment, not knowing what to do. Fire, keep firing. Until the front-line commander shouted at the top of his lungs once again. The army of crystal clusters was slowly retreating, and the originally flickering sea of amethyst was broken. The land where the smoke had dissipated showed an ominous reddish-black color. The pitch black was the embers left behind by the explosions, and the dark red was the dried blood clots. In the distance, a few long streaks of smoke fell to the horizon, and even more floating battleships gathered into a torrent. They were like a school of sparkling fish, slowly moving towards the north. When they entered the formation one by one, the sides of the ship were exposed. The entire sky suddenly flashed with a dazzling brilliance. Cannons boomed above the clouds, and the light of destruction poured down like raindrops. The raindrops directly penetrated the horseshoe insect army and projected the light of death on the plains. A series of flashes lit up on the plains north of the Paris Valley. Even from miles away, the people on the city walls could still feel the tremors of the earth. However, that was just the beginning. In this era, losing the sky was equivalent to losing victory. Unless the Dusk Dragon was willing to invest more horseshoe insects here and regain the advantage of the sky through an overwhelming offensive. But under everyone's gaze, the huge black hole in the center of the battlefield was gradually weakening. Obviously, even the Dragon of Destruction described in the Pale poem was not omnipotent in the world of order created by Martha. It was not invincible. At least here Erwin's people had obtained a true victory. All of a sudden, an even louder cheer broke out in the huge fortress. Like a tsunami, the cheers washed over everyone's soul. Prepare to counterattack. Monica, who was sitting on the skylight, was so surprised that she almost jumped up. She flew back to the hall and shouted at the expressionless girl Valhalla. It's time for us to vent our anger. Those damn northerners. Chapter 1497. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the haze in the sky that was swept away by the teleportation of Valhalla finally closed again. The brief sunny weather on both sides of the Parise Valley disappeared, and snow began to fall from the sky again. The two large fleets of Sarsard and Trendheim that had gathered together slowly advanced northward, but in less than half an hour they split up again. The remnants of the Crystal Cluster army and the beetles in the sky began to flee in all directions, while the fleets also split into dozens of separate subfleets to give chase. Such a scene appeared in the lead gray sky. Against the background of the rising smoke on the horizon, the scattered fleets in the sky spread out into a huge fan shape like scattered sharks, like a giant hand covering the entire Parise plain. Flashes of light flashed in the sky from time to time, and occasionally continuous roars came from the north, but the explosions were getting farther and farther away, and gradually became inaudible on both sides of the old river. The defeated northern nobles on the ground were not attacked from the sky, but after the battle on the ground was over, under Brando's orders, Tanagel's forces on the ground had begun to gather and take captives. Although these nobles' private armies were no longer the main opponents of Abes in this war, Brando could not let these people roam freely in the south. An unrestrained army sometimes caused more damage than bandits. Erwin's southern border had just recovered from a few wars, and could not suffer another disaster because of his negligence. Fortunately, most people had lost the will to resist or even collapsed. These people were almost defenseless against the Tanagel's incorporation. Even if there were a few stubborn ones, the subterranean dwellers who joined the battle were enough to quickly crush all resistance. After Brando gave the order, he flew back to the sky and looked at the Parise plain after the battle. This terrible battle had almost turned the entire battlefield into scorched earth, and wherever the Crystal Army passed, strong traces of chaos magic were left behind. The battlefield was covered with blue to purple crystal clusters, which were the manifestation of chaos magic in the material world. These remnants would continue to pollute the land for the next 10 years, decaying the vegetation and causing a disease called crystallization disease. In addition to these unnatural distortions of magic, the scorched earth was the result of the destructive firepower of the two large fleets. It was inevitable to face such losses in a war in the humans' homeland, but for survival and victory, this was an inevitable choice. The black and red land, the contamination of crystals near and far, and the wreckage of a few floating battleships in the distance. The once beautiful Parise plain had disappeared, leaving behind an ugly and twisted scar. Perhaps this scar in the north of Tanagel would not heal for the next 10 years, until the contamination of the crystals disappeared, and the land was covered by green vegetation. Brando sighed, but he knew in his heart that this was just the beginning. The Twilight War was inevitable, and no one knew what kind of future awaited this world. All he could do was to do everything possible to prevent the tragedy of the stagnation realm from repeating on this land. Fortunately, there was still hope. He looked at the ruins of Maxon City, searching for something. At the same time, he contacted Monica through the magic network of the world tree that covered both sides of the old river. Lady Light Spirit's voice was distorted in the magic network. "My lord, there's good news. I just asked the survivors from Maxon, and they said that Lady Maynard and Red Copper Dragon Leto were fine before we launched the counterattack. However, they joined us in launching a counterattack against the noble army of Duke Grenoir's. There's no follow-up news for now." Lady Light Spirit's voice was a little distorted in the magic network, and she said in a sharp voice, "My lord, there's good news." Brendel was slightly relieved. Although he had a hunch that this would happen, he noticed that the defenses of Maxon Hill had not been completely destroyed when he first arrived. This meant that there were still people in the city organizing the defense. It was either by Jia or the Red Copper Dragon Leto. "There's another piece of news, Sir Overlord." Monica spoke up again. "Well, there is someone here who wants to see you. She said she is an acquaintance of yours." "An acquaintance of mine?" Brando was stunned. There were many people in Tanagel that he was acquainted with, but there were not many of them that Monica did not know. From the Light Spirit's words, it was obvious that this was an acquaintance that she had never seen before. "Where are you?" "We are in the ruins of Maxon City. Can you see us?" "I see you." In fact, Brando had already seen the Light Spirit and the lady standing beside her. He could not help but be slightly startled. "Lady Irene?" Brando slowly descended from the sky. He was pleasantly surprised to see the dear demon standing beside Monica. It was Irene who had fought side by side with him in Kelsey's mausoleum. However, she looked even weaker than before. The crystallization disease had spread to her entire right arm and back. The combination of the purple crystal and the tissue of her body looked a little terrifying. However, Irene did not seem to have been defeated by the crystallization disease. When she saw Brando, her face showed a familiar smile. "Little guy, we meet again." Monica looked at the deer-bodied banshee and then at Brendel. She blinked her eyes and felt like she had missed something. "Can you leave Sir Kelsey's mausoleum?" Brando asked, a little surprised. Irene shook her head. "No, I left Sir Kelsey's mausoleum for the same thing. I felt the aura of the Twilight Dragon behind those people. You know, it is my master's old rival." Brando certainly understood the grievances between the Darkness Dragon and the planeswalkers of that generation and the Twilight Dragon. He nodded and said, "They are the Sisaldians. The Grey Mages of the Bugas have chosen to side with the Twilight Dragon." "I know them, little guy," Irene replied to Brando's surprise. "I came to the surface to remind you that there is something strange about these people." "Something strange?" Brendel was taken aback and looked at her strangely. He did not quite understand what she meant by strange. "Little guy, you may not know, but before the war began, these Sisaldian Grey Mages were looking for something in the whole of Tanajal." "Ah." Monica seemed to have reacted when she heard this. She quickly said loudly, "I remember now. Those annoying little rats still sneaked into our fortress, but it seems that Sir Babu has already subdued them. Do you want to see them, Sir Overlord?" "I don't think they will tell you the answer." Helene shook her head. "I've secretly captured quite a few of them. These wizards don't even know what they're looking for. They're only looking for the mana gathering point beneath Trentheim. I think what they're looking for is related to the seal I'm guarding." Brando frowned. "Madame Irene, what is the seal that Sir Kelsey and the Witch Empress are guarding?" "I don't know." Irene shook her head. "Perhaps it is something important, but my master has never revealed any information to me or that dull pendulum." Brendel only shrugged when he heard that. Irene's words made him think of something, but all in all, the clues were still a mess. He knew that 1,000 years ago, Odin and the Flame King had started to set things up in Erewhon. Martha and the Twilight Dragon had also set their sights on this place. In short, this small kingdom was now a mess. Perhaps there was something important under Tanajal. Perhaps it was the long-lost Holy Sword of Light of the 7 Sacred Swords. He might find out the truth sooner or later, but he really did not have the time to think about this problem now. At least for now, the Twilight Dragon's claw had been slapped back. Before it recovered, Tanajal was still safe for the time being. He just had to guard against the infiltration of the Sisaldian wizards. However, Brando had enough reason to believe that these annoying grey wizards would not have the leisure to do anything else soon. He raised his head and looked at the grey sky. "I owe you another favor, Madame Irene." Of course, Brando could see that this place had experienced a great battle. The stone statues of the noble army and the crisscrossing vines on top of the ruins explained everything. This was a strategic route to Fort Mintel. If Irene had not blocked the Duke of Grenoir's army here, with the little forces of Allium Japonicum and the Reto, they would not have been able to wait until Fort Valhalla came to support them. Sometimes, Brando had to admit that fate was indeed full of all kinds of coincidences. If it had not been for the chance encounter in the underground tomb, he would not have been able to rely on the Paradise of Adversity deck to defeat William, let alone the Cruz Empire and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Today, if it had not been for this deer-bodied banshee, he might have had to face the tragedy of history repeating itself in the land of Erewhon. The deer-bodied banshee showed a very chic smile on her face. "Then you have to remember the favor you owe me. How do you plan to repay me? Don't forget that you are my little lover." "Little lover?" Monica turned her little head curiously at the side, and her eyes couldn't help but widen. Brando coughed a little awkwardly. He recalled the absurd scene that happened in the tomb and said with some embarrassment, "Madame Irene, do you still remember my promise? I think I have found a way to solve it." Irene was slightly startled, but then her eyes lit up. "Is what you said true, little guy?" She was so excited that her voice trembled a little. Although she had experienced a life that was far longer than a human's, living in the darkness with her companions for thousands of years, such an experience made her see life and death lightly. However, if they could continue to live, no one would choose to die, right? Even if Irene knew that Brando would not joke with her about this kind of thing, when it came to it, she could not help but feel dizzy in disbelief. You really did it, little guy?" "Of course it's true." Seeing the deer-bodied banshee so excited, Brando could not help but feel happy for her. If there were some aftereffects of using the Spring of Life to purify the crystallization disease, there would be no problem at all with the more powerful dragon blood pool. "I really did not misjudge you, little guy." Irene's voice trembled a little. She raised her hand, held Brando's face and murmured, "Thank you, my little lover." If it was any other time, having his face held by a lady who was almost 2 heads taller than him, Brando might feel a little embarrassed. However, he could completely understand the sincere feelings in Irene's heart. Although she kept saying that Brando was her little lover, this kind of feeling was not so much the attraction between the opposite sex, but a kind of silent affection between close relatives. It was just like the relationship between siblings. After a while, Irene calmed down, a trace of shyness flashed in her green eyes. Probably because she felt embarrassed for losing her composure, she grabbed Brando's hand and said, "Thank you, little guy. You have done so much for me. I also want to do something for you." "What? Aren't you looking for your other little lover? I know where she is. Come on my back, I will bring you to see her." Brando was caught off guard and hurriedly rejected, "Madam Irene, I can keep up with you. As for the second request, forget it." However, Elaine revealed a somewhat angry expression. "Little fellow, you saved my life. Don't tell me that I can't even repay you with such a small favor? Yes, our race hates it the most when others treat them as mounts, but if it is my dearest little brother and lover, of course there is an exception." Saying that, she even winked at Brando. "Ah." Miss Lightspirit quickly shook her head and said loudly, "Monica did not see anything." Chapter 1498. When Brando saw Maynard or Allium japonicum again, it was in a forest a few miles away from Fort Mind on the north bank of the Ord River. A camp belonging to the noble's private army was destroyed by the light cavalry here. After passing through the collapsed tents, the flag with the emblem of the Duke of Grenoires lay in the mud and was trampled on. In the tent at the end of the path, Brando saw his senior, who seemed to be sleeping soundly. Her eyes were closed and her long eyelashes were motionless. Her snow-white neck and even chin were stained with mud and blood. She was wearing Erwin's knight's battle robe. Her injured chest was red, but fortunately, it was only an injury. As she breathed, her full breasts rose and fell gently. Miss Maynard lost too much blood and accidentally tore her wound in the final battle. The others couldn't persuade her. "I'm sorry, Sir Lord," Redo said apologetically. "It's not your fault, Redo." Brando interrupted the veteran. He knew that his senior was not like this. Maynard must have taken over the main personality in the final stage. But in any case, it was fine as long as the two were fine. No matter how serious the injury was, it was insignificant in front of the power of rebirth contained in the dragon blood pool. And it just so happened that he could use the power of rebirth to create a new body for his senior. At this time, Brando turned around and glanced at Irene. There were three main reasons why he looked for the spring of life. First, he promised to completely cure the stag banshee's crystallization disease. Second, it was to help Count Yenbao's daughter, Maynard, recover. Finally, it was to separate his senior's soul so that she and Maynard could have their own lives. Now the two main characters were here. Although Dilfrey was still far away in the Yenbao territory, and her life or death was unknown, the recovery of the Count's daughter's body required a very small amount of the dragon blood pool's power, so he only needed to reserve that part in advance. "Then, Sir Feudal Lord, I will wait for you outside." Seeing the intention of his feudal lord, Redo promptly excused himself. After following Brando for so long, the veteran knew that his liege had some secrets of his own. Besides, even if his liege and this lady wanted to save Miss Maynard, there was nothing he could do as a man. After Redo walked out of the tent, Brando said, "Madame Helene, I want to use the power of the dragon's blood pool to heal her injuries. Your crystallization disease can also be cured in it." Dragon blood pool. Hearing this term, Helene couldn't help but cry out, "Little fellow, you actually found that kind of thing. No wonder you were so confident that you could cure my crystallization disease." "I was just lucky. I only knew that there was a spring of life in the Black Forest in the south. I originally planned to use the power of the spring of life to purify the crystallization disease in your body. But I didn't expect to get an even more powerful dragon's blood pool. Maybe this is Lady Martha's blessing." Brando replied, feeling a little emotional. The power of the spring of life was strong enough to purify the crystallization disease and heal Dilfrey's body, but it was not enough to build a body. He never thought that he would get the dragon's blood pool on the way back to Erwin, and all the problems would be solved. Maybe it's true. Helene couldn't help but mutter to herself. She gently stroked her cheeks that were full of crystal spikes with her hand. She couldn't suppress the excitement in her heart. When an impossible thing became reality in front of her, anyone would lose their composure like this. Brando looked at her and wanted to say a few words of comfort, but he didn't expect that the dear demoness had already narrowed her eyes slightly. "But compared to this, what surprised me more is you, little fellow." "What?" "In my memory, although the spring of life is not as powerful as the dragon's blood pool, it is still mysterious and unfathomable. You actually know the exact information about it? Helene looked down at Brando with her green eyes. How many more secrets do you know, little fellow? Well, Brando couldn't help but feel a little guilty under her gaze. He knew many secrets, but there were some that he really couldn't say. It wasn't that he wanted to deceive anyone. In order to change the topic, Brando had to cough softly. The spring of life is swimming in the Black Forest. I can't say too much. I understand. You don't want to disappoint those who believe in you. Helene smiled faintly. She paused for a moment before speaking again. But you're right, little one. Compared to the spring of life, using the power of the dragon blood pool on me is too much of a waste. I'm not so bad that I can't wait for this little bit of time. As for this lady's injuries, she pointed at Maynard, you don't need to use the dragon blood pool so much. If those druids under your command can't do anything about it, I can think of something for you. The dear demoness raised her right hand and a soft green ball of light appeared in the middle of her palm. Speaking of nature magic, the druids learned it from us. Our ancestors were also the golden tribe of the forest. Thank you, Miss Helene. But it might not be that simple. Brando shook his head and explained the situation of Maynard and Allium Japonicum to the dear demoness. However, the background of Allium Japonicum and Maynard was too shocking. Of course, he still held back and omitted the part about Martha. It wasn't impossible to have two souls in one body in this world of magic. Brendel only said that Maynard and her sister had been cursed by a witch before they were born, and that was why such a situation had occurred. Although Helene looked a little suspicious, she was smart and didn't ask. After listening to Brando's explanation, she nodded. You mean you need me to stay and help you maintain the ritual, right? Helene looked at Maynard, who was lying on the stretcher, and then looked at Brando with a thoughtful expression. Brando nodded. Yes. The situation in Erewhon is chaotic right now. Her Highness, Amandina, and Freya are still in danger. I can't stay here for too long. Then when do you plan to begin, little one? Helene asked. As soon as possible. Brando replied. If possible, it would be best to find a quiet and secluded place to complete the ritual. But there were no such conditions, so he could only keep it simple. The situation in Count Randner was worsening by the minute. Even if Trenthium's current victory could affect the war in the north, it would take at least a few days before it could affect the situation in the north. But Amandina was in the enemy's hands, and Brando didn't want to waste a second. The power of the dragon's blood pool is very strong, and it's not picky about the ritual's environment. It can be completed anywhere as long as it's not disturbed by the outside world. I understand, Helene nodded. Don't worry, little one, I'll ensure your little lover's safety. Brando didn't have time to explain that Maynard had nothing to do with him. Anyway, it was only Helene's misunderstanding. With her personality, she wouldn't communicate with outsiders, so it wouldn't affect her reputation as a knight. He only nodded. Thank you, Lady Helene. I don't need your thanks, Helene replied with a smile. You have to be careful of those Cisaldians. They won't admit defeat easily. If you want to act against them, it's best to find allies. I understand. Brando nodded. Creating any life was the most taboo domain for alchemists and necromancers. Necromancers had explored this path for nearly 1,000 years, but they still couldn't solve the biggest mystery between life and death. As for the path to eternity, it was even more distant. The undead called it the Eternal Kingdom, but in front of the true power of life, it was nothing more than dust built on decay. Because creation was the domain of gods. Although he had the power of the dragon's blood pool, Brando didn't dare to arrogantly claim that he wanted to create life. Fortunately, he didn't need the true power of creation. The secret of eternal life was stored in the soul. Brando created nothing more than a carrier for the soul. Senior Allium Japonicum's soul was powerful, but it lacked a container, or a shell. In fact, in theory, the magic circle Brando drew was also a kind of necromancy, but with the help of the powerful life force of the dragon's blood pool, it naturally wouldn't create something lifeless like the necromancers. The whole ritual lasted for several hours. After the dragon's blood pool stabilized, Brando left the tent with relief. Next, the boiling dragon's blood would continue to build Senior's body under the guidance of the ritual, which would take several days. Brando ordered Reto to seal off the whole forest and told him that no one was allowed to come close to the tent for the next few days. Reto certainly didn't know what was happening in the tent. He only thought that the dear demon was healing Maynard's injuries. Since Brando told him that the process couldn't be disturbed, the veteran who had been in the war for many years would carry out this order meticulously. It didn't matter if it was a day or a few days. This wasn't just out of loyalty, but also out of duty to protect the comrades who fought side by side. Brando was a little apologetic about the veteran's loyalty. After all, he didn't tell the truth. However, he also understood that this matter was too shocking. In order to protect the privacy of the female knight and senior, he shouldn't say too much. After leaving the forest, Brando asked Monica to extend Valhalla's roots to this area. After all, ordinary soldiers could only guard against ordinary people, but there were many annoying magi here. Although the battle with Paris had come to an end, no one could guarantee that there wouldn't be any accidents before the battlefield was cleaned up. The only thing that puzzled Brando was that the deer demon insisted on not purifying her crystallization illness before the dragon's blood ritual was completed. She insisted on waiting for Maynard and Allium Japonicum to recover before completing the process alone. Although Brando had some doubts, he didn't object. He wasn't worried that Helene wouldn't use the power of the dragon's blood pool, because the deer demon should understand that once the power of the dragon's blood pool was activated, it wouldn't stop. It would be a waste if she didn't use it. He could only understand Helene's choice as the deer demon wasn't willing to show her weak side in front of him. After leaving the forest, Brando contacted Monica again and asked her to arrange for him to meet one of the main culprits of this war. To be exact, this person was one of the trophies of the battle between Maynard and Retto. The other party was the Grand Duke of Grenoires. This Grand Duke was captured when Maynard and Retto launched a counterattack. Speaking of which, he was unlucky. In theory, the remaining forces of Fort Mind were far from enough to hold him back. However, when the army led by Abes launched an attack, this respectable Grand Duke was stabbed in the back by his own people. It was the Crystal Cluster Army and Horseshoe Beetles that Baron Dahl had summoned in a frenzy. Under the attack of these monsters, the Northern Private Army completely collapsed. Naturally, this Grand Duke was not spared. I don't want to see him, but it's not to show off that I'm the winner in front of him. If it was under normal circumstances, I wouldn't mind doing so. After all, I have a little bit of vanity. But now he wasn't in the mood. In fact, he didn't have the time. Because compared to these, he had more important things to do. Chapter 1499. It was in Valhalla's Tree Hall that he met the famous Duke, but he had never met him before. The Archduke of Grenoires, the current head of the Tazim family, was dressed in heavy black armor and had a bearskin cloak draped over his shoulders. Although his weapons had been forcibly removed, and his hair was a little messy, his spirit was not dispirited. He raised his head calmly and looked at Brando, who walked into the hall. "You are that guy's grandson? I didn't expect that I would be defeated by his descendant." "You lost to greed and your own weak-willed Duke." Brando stared at the man. The man's cold gaze hid a weakness that no one knew about. At least compared to Duke Erek's arrogance, this Duke was not even worth mentioning. "From the moment you betrayed Owain, your fate was sealed." Brendel replied flatly. "Whatever you say," Grand Duke Grenoires replied. "Tell me," Brando said, "what is the matter with the royal faction? I believe they are fickle, but if they have the ability to endure, they would not have lost so badly in the last war." The Duke sneered. "Young man, if you're here to make me bow to you and that little girl, then I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you. I'm not on the same side as you. You might be able to fool that old fool, but I happen to know that very well." "In other words, you intend to bury the entire Tarsim family because of your stubbornness?" The Duke's expression changed slightly, but he was silent for a moment and replied, "Young man, I want to remind you that the people of Sassold are not to be trifled with. On the contrary, Duke, if the conflict between you and me is only the internal conflict of Erewhon, then the price that the people of Sassold have to pay has just begun." Duke Grenoires looked at Brando with some surprise. He could not tell if this young man was too arrogant or just too confident. "Tell me, Makarov or Oberway, who is the real mastermind?" Brando continued to ask without any expression. Duke Grenoires' lips twitched, but he did not say anything. Brando looked at him for a moment, and then turned to Anne Ruff, the Archdruid of the Loop of Trade Winds. "Elder Anne Ruff, please inform the Loop of the World and the Archdruids. Ask them if they still remember the agreement from the previous era, and if they still remember Lady Martha's standards. Tell them that if the Silver Folk allow their scum to interfere with the mortal world, then I will have to personally start a mortal war, and destroy the last pride of the Silver Folk in a sea of fire. My lord, you, go, they'll understand what I'm saying." Grand Duke Grenoelson frowned at the scene. He could not believe that a mere Count Tonagel dared to talk to the Druid's Ring of the World in such an arrogant tone, not to mention that the other party had even shamelessly claimed to destroy the Silver Folk. It was as ridiculous as the small states along the Silver Bay claiming to destroy the Cruz Empire. But what surprised him was that the archdruid from the Loop of Trade Winds bowed respectfully to Brando with a complicated expression, and then left. Duke Grimoires certainly understood the relationship between the Tonagel and the druids of the Loop of Trade Winds, but he did not understand why Brando showed him this scene. Did he want to scare him with these big words? This was simply too laughable. But his frown only lasted for a few seconds. Not long after Anruff left the tree hall, a white light suddenly flashed in the center of the hall, and a silver fairy appeared there. It was obviously spatial magic, and it was the legendary ultra-long-distance teleportation. Grand Duke Grimoires was not an ignorant ordinary person. He knew at a glance that the other party must be an ally of the Bugas, the Light Fairies, and the only fairy clan in the world that was good at law magic. Needless to say, the other party must have come to this place through the ultra-long-distance directional teleportation circle of the Bugas. And just as Duke Grimoires was shocked by this scene, the fairy lady spoke. She said to Brando somewhat sternly, "Brando, you can't do that. Although the private actions of the Sassaldans have seriously violated the principles of the Silver Alliance, you can't let the entire Silver folk bear this mistake." Lady Tanya. Brando only needed to hear the voice to know who had come, although he did not expect the Bugas to come so quickly. Although the Bugas and the Loop of the World had different ideas, as a remnant of the order of the previous era, when he asked Anruff to inform the Loop of the World, the Bugas should have received the news immediately. After all, for them, this should be the most urgent situation next to the coming of dusk. But Brando was not interested in the Bugas' reaction. He was even a little annoyed. The petty actions of the Sassaldans could not be hidden from the Bugas. What they did in Erewhon was almost transparent to the other Bugas from the beginning. The so-called shocking of the entire Silver City state seriously violated the principles of the Silver Alliance. If it was someone else they might have considered it, but Brando did not care at all. He was very clear about the Bugas' code of conduct. The Bugas obviously put the arrival of the Dusk Army as their primary consideration. As for the violation and even betrayal of the Sassaldans, although it also annoyed them, it was also a secondary matter to be dealt with. It was because of this thinking that the Bugas ignored Erewhon in the first place, because they could come back and clean up the mess at any time anyway. And as for what kind of upheaval would happen in the mortal world because of this, and how many people would pay the price of their lives, that was naturally not within the scope of the Bugas' concern. The arrogance of the Cloud Dwellers was vividly displayed at this moment. Brando could even guess that the Sassaldans were taking advantage of this mentality of the Bugas. As citizens of the Silver City State, they knew the Cloud Dwellers better than anyone else. By the time the Bugas came back to deal with them, they would have already helped their masters get what they wanted in Erewhon. Brando knew the rules of the game of the Bugas. But now he had returned to Erewhon, so the rules of the game had to be reformulated. Since the Bugas felt that the fire of Erewhon had not yet burned them, then he would add fuel to the fire. "Since you don't care, then I'll make you care about it." Brando looked at Tanya somewhat indifferently. To be honest, not only the Bugas, but he was also very dissatisfied with this fairy lady. After all, she had a good relationship with Her Highness the Princess, but she also ignored everything that happened here and watched Griffin fall into danger. Seeing Brando's expression, Tanya was slightly stunned and she sighed. "I'm sorry, Brando, I know you blame me." "No, I don't have to blame anyone," Brando said mercilessly. "I only make a simple choice. I will declare war on the Sassaldans or on all the Silver Folk, depending on your answer." "No, you can't be so capricious," Tanya said with some annoyance. "The most important thing now is to fight against the invasion of the Twilight Dragon. If you rashly start a wizard war, the Silver Folk and the mortal kingdoms will turn into a sea of fire, and we will fail completely. But before that, the Silver Folk will lose the authority from Tiamat because of the all-out war with the mortal world. You will lose your status as the world's guardian and the right to be arrogant. You know all about it?" Tanya's eyes widened in surprise. Brando did not answer. Ever since he received the highest authority from Martha in the Stagnation Realm, he had understood everything. This was an era of mortals defined by Martha, and it was impossible for power to be unrestrained. In the game, the Wizards' War eventually destroyed themselves, and the Slate War caused the Bugas to fall to the mortal world. This was the root of all this. The fairy's face became serious. She hesitated again and again before she admonished, "Brando, you have to consider the price of doing this. I understand your hatred for the Sassaldians, but are you going to let it blind you?" "You still don't understand, Lady Tanya. This is not hatred." Brando shook his head gently. "What I see clearly is that the arrogance of the Sassaldians comes from the Bugas, and it is precisely because of the Silver Folk's self-indulgence that all this has happened. This is not only the responsibility of the Sisaldians, but the responsibility of all the Bugas. He paused for a moment, then answered word by word, however, you still deal with this responsibility with arrogance, so I think that such a silver alliance is no longer enough to fulfill the heavy responsibility that Lady Martha has given you. Lady Tanya, you can't save our world. Tanya took a deep breath, and a surge of anger suddenly surged into her chest. Since when had mortals dared to be so rude to the people of the clouds? Don't they understand who has been guarding this world? But she glared fiercely at the young man, but did not dare to speak arrogantly, because she knew that the other party had the ability to perish together with them. Should she endure the humiliation, or should she turn into ashes with the mortals? She was in a dilemma for a moment. But Brando seemed to have seen through her thoughts and said lightly, Lady Tanya, I didn't take any chances from the beginning. If you still think that the mortals have stolen your authority and refuse to accept your charity, then please choose the second path. Because I believe that although the people of the earth are humble, Lady Martha has already given them her blessings, and they will eventually complete their self-redemption. Use their power to split open the era that belongs to them, and those who stand in the way of all this will eventually turn into ashes. Whether it is a god or a demon that destroys the world, the fairy lady did not say a word. She almost couldn't help but curse several times, but after a long silence she silently closed her eyes as if listening to something several times. She couldn't help but shake her head at first, then finally nodded, then shook her head again, frowning. All right, she said in her mind, let's see the final madness of these arrogant people. A bitter laugh came from the void. After a long time, Tanya looked at Brando angrily and said, Since Lady Martha has given you that crown, very well. Well, we give you power. This is to tell you that the Buga people are not as arrogant as you think. You are just mortals, you don't understand where power comes from. I want to see how you will save this world, and I hope you won't regret it. Brando did not explain anything to Tanya's sarcasm. He just thought silently for a moment. He understood that at this moment, he had truly taken over the responsibility that Lady Martha had given him. He thought that when he took over all this, he would not be able to continue because what ability did he have to decide the future of this world? But when this moment came, he felt a sense of relief. Because there was no need to hesitate. There was no need to talk about regret. He just needed to let go of everything and use all his strength to move forward. Brando looked up, and when he lifted his head, it was as if there really was the weight of a crown. That was what Martha had promised him, his mission. As the saying goes, if you want to wear a crown, you must bear its weight. Brando turned his head, and his gaze was fixed on Duke Grenoir's. The gaze that the Duke did not care about before was now like a sharp sword piercing his heart. It was more than 1,000 pounds, and it made him shudder. Duke Grenoir's was just glanced at, and he subconsciously lowered his head, not daring to look at it. It was as if he was facing that gaze in the high-arched and deep hall when the kingdom was in the ascendant. It came from Erwin, the Lord of Resurgence. The majesty that came from the taciturn was like the snow in the winter, chilling him to the bone. But at this moment it was still better. Like a trembling subject being stared at by his monarch, Duke Grenoir's felt that his will had been stripped away from his body. He could not resist at all and could only answer dryly, It was Makarov, your Majesty. Lord Oberway was turned into his appearance by that monster, and he was imprisoned in the summer castle near Bragg's. What I said is true. They also wanted to replace your adjutant with that monster, Lady Yuda. In the hall, only Duke Grenoir's voice was left, and he was repeating in a hollow voice. The fairy stared at Brando expressionlessly, watching all of this. Chapter 1500. Magadal looked at Canterbell City from afar. The trade town that connected Silver Bay to the wilderness of the Four Territories seemed a little lonely in the morning fog. This was not the city she was familiar with. Those who relied on the daily operations of this huge city, the farmers, craftsmen, and the merchants who shuttled through the various trade routes, were usually busy at dawn, waking the city from its slumber. Before the first ray of sunlight fell, the ancient city would be filled with fresh colors. But today the city was like a sleeping beast, silently creeping on the fertile fields outside the aloe forest. The morning breeze blew through Magadal's hair, and the unusual atmosphere in the air made the princess of the church even more uneasy. In the huge military tent behind her, the noises of dispute represented the various lords of the allied forces from the Silver Bay region. They had yet to come to an agreement. After the disaster of White Mountain, the Wind Elves announced a blockade of their borders, and prohibited any outsiders from passing through their territory. The Alliance army's path to the north was thus cut off, and the people were discussing whether they should change their route through the wilderness of the Four Territories, through the territory controlled by the Empire's Red Army. They had all kinds of concerns. But the most important factor was the safety of the army. Since the fall of the Black Moon, there had been no news from the wilderness of the Four Territories. The humans and the Wind Elves had withdrawn from the confrontation, and the last news that the Red Army was trying to get close to the forces of the Crown Prince in the north, but then the entire army mysteriously disappeared, as if they had disappeared overnight. Before the disaster of White Mountain, Veronica asked the Wind Elves to send scouts to the west of the wilderness of the Four Territories in order to determine the location of the Red Army. But when the elves reached the east of Anzaruta, they only saw a large number of Highlanders migrating north. The Highlanders' homeland was completely turned into a sea of fire due to the fall of the Black Moon, and the migration of the Anzaruta region triggered a group reaction from the Highlanders. The clans that originally lived on both sides of the Buta River, the river was located to the east of Vargas, where Brando had once passed by, and in Anzaruta's territory, it was the most ancient and sacred land of the Anzaruta Highlanders, migrated north to the Red Mountain region, and the local clans of the Red Mountain continued north to the south of the wilderness of the Four Territories. Among these migrating clans, none of them claimed to have seen the Crew's army disappear on the road. And after the disaster of White Mountain, the elves closed the country, and news from the north and south was cut off. Some people speculated that the Red Army may have been destroyed by the Twilight Dragon, or the most optimistic explanation was that the Crew's people were besieged in the southeast of the Evergreen Corridor. In fact, after losing the natural barrier of the Highlanders of the Anzaruta, the area of the wilderness of the Four Territories and Evergreen Corridor had become a possible enemy territory. In other words, no one dared to guarantee that the Allied army could safely pass through this area. There were always differences, but under the insistence of the ferocious Alpha Wolf, of the Anzaruta family, the Allied army still approached the vicinity of Canebell. Here, Duke Brandon finally had to give up his unyielding style, and for the first time, an intense argument broke out among the nobles. Canebell, the most important trading city in the west of the wilderness of the Four Territories. After passing through this strategic hub, they would only need to walk for another 2 to 3 days to reach the safe southern border of the Alcash Mountains. But at the same time, this route was also the most dangerous choice. Ever since the fall of the Black Moon, the Wind Elf scouts had never come to this area. The fall of the Black Moon had created a hideous wound between the sublime inland sea and Anzaruta, and the end of this wound was at the westernmost part of Canebell. The map had lost its function here, and the disaster had changed this place beyond recognition. It was more like a black hole that chose people to devour. With the appearance of the first ray of sunlight, the morning breeze began to warm up. But the scouts that were sent out had yet to return. Magadal knew that the people's hearts were becoming more and more unstable. Without any warning, a coarse and large hand was placed on her shoulder. This Princess Antoabarua was slightly startled and turned her head. Her blue eyes were filled with worry and surprise as she looked at her grandfather. When she opened her mouth, her voice was so light that it seemed to be able to break the silence of the morning. "Grandfather, why are you here? Aren't you in the tent persuading everyone?" As you can see, persuasion is only effective at certain times. Everyone knows the danger ahead. The old Duke walked to his granddaughter's side and looked at the horizon as he replied. Magadal shook her head. This was the war with the dusk. It was a legend written in the history books, but they were unlucky to be here. But everyone knew that if they retreated back to Silver Bay, they would not be able to survive. "Mr. Brando would not lie to us," Magadal said crisply. "Perhaps there will be deaths, but we still have a chance to win." That person, he had never let down those who trusted him. She had seen it with her own eyes. "I also believe in him. After all, he is the descendant of that person. I have seen the same shadow in him. I believe that they are both people who can change everything." The old Duke recalled the time when he met Brando, but what he saw was a silver sea. Countless fluttering spears and flags, and in the vast wilderness, the knights were chanting the name of that person. But in the end they all turned into a single note. Victory. 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 That tall figure stood motionless. Until it became a monument that was engraved in everyone's heart. Behind it was an ancient family name. "Then why don't you say it clearly?" Magadal asked. Brando shook his head. "Everyone is brave enough. What more can you ask for? But bravery is one thing. Being afraid of death is not cowardice. The key is that people know the value of death. A worthless death is dishonorable. But Lady Veronica is still waiting for us. Babel Fortress is in danger. We promised Mr. Brando. That's why I'm standing here with you, isn't it? The old man winked cheekily at his granddaughter. I hope the scouts can bring back good news from Candlebell City. If Lady Martha can still hear our prayers, it means that she has not given up on her children. The wind blew in from the wilderness outside Candlebell City. The two suddenly stopped talking and turned around at the same time. The morning fog had retreated into the depths of the forest. The forest in the distance was undulating like waves, and the wind was mixed with the rustling of the leaves. But Magadol suddenly realized that under such a natural sound, the fierce argument in the tent had disappeared. Did the lords come to an agreement? How could it be? They would not be able to solve the problem without arguing for at least an hour. Brando was an experienced general. He immediately pulled out his sword and protected Magadol behind him. Before he could finish, Duke Malvis from the Sword-Poke Forest came out of the tent. Behind! Behind! The latter screamed with a pale face. When he walked out of the tent, he tripped and almost fell into the brazier. If it weren't for the guards at the side who quickly caught him, he would have died. Brando took him from the guard and helped him up, trying to wake him up. At the same time he asked, "Damn it, what happened?" He looked into the tent. The tent was in a mess. Wah. Dusk. Duke Malvis stuttered and tried to push Brando away. "Look at you, you good-for-nothing brat from the Malvis family. Wake up." The old Duke angrily threw him to the ground and grabbed his collar. "What the hell happened? Tell me," he roared. Duke Malvis seemed to have woken up. His eyes regained some focus. He opened his dry and cracked lips and was about to say something. But at this moment, a scream attracted Brando's attention. He turned around and saw a few knights rushing out from the forest in that direction. "My lord, our scout is back," the knight shouted. Before he could finish, a man covered in blood was carried over. He was still conscious and shouted, "My lord, we found them." "They who?" Blank threw Malvis aside and asked with a frown in that direction. "Cruz's men, the Red Army." "What?" The old duke was shocked and asked, "Where are they?" The scout shook his head. "They told us to run, my lord. It'll be too late if we don't." "What the hell are you talking about?" Frank had a dissatisfied look on his face. The quality of the soldiers of the Silver Bay states may not be as good as the elites of the other empires, but the scouts were the sharp blades of the army. How could they not speak clearly? Even the most basic level of calmness could not be maintained. Brando was about to scold him, but before he could say anything, Duke Malvis, who was sitting on the ground, suddenly stood up and grabbed his arm. "Listen to him, leave this damned place," Duke Malvis shouted with a pale face. Brando was about to scold him, but he stopped. He seemed to have realized something and pushed Duke Malvis's hand away. He walked quickly to the edge of the forest and looked towards the northwest of Candebel. It was in the opposite direction of Candebel City. The vast forest formed a sea of green, and there seemed to be a few inconspicuous black dots in the sky. Brando, the White Wolf Grand Swordsman, was very sensitive. This was not the first time he had seen such a scene in the 60 years of war. He knew that it was not dust on the horizon, but a large group flying in the sky. Other than the migration of migratory birds, there was only one other situation that would cause such a scene. That was war. The old man turned around. He knew that he might have encountered the worst situation, but he still maintained a calm expression. He asked his subordinate, "Where are Cruz's men?" Perhaps every minute and every second would determine life and death, but as the former commander of the Allied army, this was not enough to make him nervous. Some people had experienced the most tragic war, and those who survived were only fulfilling the promise of living for those who had died. Moreover, they were still burdened with the lost glory. There was no situation that could make these veterans bow their heads. The war they had experienced was once known as the Perennial War. It was a battlefield where they danced with death. "We guessed wrong, sir," the scout was almost crying. "Cruz's men have been fighting against those monsters in Candebel. They intend to bypass Babel Fortress and attack the hinterland of Saint Tassol. Cruz's men sent a messenger to ask for help, but they did not arrive." Brando took a deep breath, as if he needed to let the cold air fill his lungs again to calm himself down. Duke Malvis stumbled forward and grabbed his arm again. "Let's go, Uncle Brando." In a moment of desperation, he almost called out the name he used to call the strict elder when he was young. At that time, his father was still alive, and he was not the master of the Malvis family yet. Behind, there are also those monsters, countless of them. If we don't leave now, it'll be too late. It's already too late. Brando shook off this useless fellow. He understood that the others might have already brought their men and fled. He pointed sternly at the tip of Duke Malvis's nose and said, "Go and get the others back. Our only chance is to retreat into Candabel City." "No, I can't do it." Duke Malvis shook his head in fear. Brando snorted coldly. He turned his sword around and swept the hilt of the sword across the fellow's stomach, causing the latter to bend over like a shrimp in pain. However, the old Duke quickly grabbed the fellow's collar again and pulled Duke Malvis in front of him. He said loudly, "I saved your life because of your father. Listen carefully. If you don't want to die, do as I say." However, Duke Malvis still looked hesitant. Brando could not help but shake his head in disappointment. "You are far from your father, little fellow from the Malvis family," he said bluntly. "No matter how fast you run, can you escape the eyes of the heavens?" Duke Malvis's jaw dropped. He seemed to have finally remembered who was the most authoritative expert here. No one could be compared to the deputy marshal of the Allied forces 60 years ago. He subconsciously asked, "Uncle Brando, how can I get the others back?" "I know what you're thinking," Brando replied. "But if we don't gather together, even if we retreat into Candabel City, we will still die." Seeing Duke Malvis stumbling away, Magadal, who had already regained her composure, could not help but ask, "Grandfather, can we really defend Candabel City?" The old man shook his head. Magadal was a little surprised at her own indifference to safety. She suddenly realized that this answer did not cause any ripples in her heart. Perhaps it was because she had already expected this answer? She suddenly thought that this could be her burial ground, but she was not afraid. Perhaps she was destined to be different from those mediocre people. After a moment of silence, she asked again, "If Cruz's people can hold on for so long, can we?" "Cruz's people can't either." Brando sighed. He walked to the outermost edge of the forest, and the plains of Candabel could be seen clearly in the distance. The old Duke raised his hand and pointed at a black shadow on the horizon. "Do you see it?" That thin black line appeared on the horizon in the northwest. And very quickly it became a sea. It was a purple sea. It swallowed everything in its path. The forest and the lake were like a lone boat on the stormy sea, disappearing in an instant. Magadal's blue eyes were filled with shock. "Do you think Cruz's people can stop them?" Brando asked his granddaughter. Magadal shook her head silently. The old man was silent. Then he said, "They came from the Alcash region." "What?" The cracks in the sacred oath caused by the catastrophe of White Mountain could not be hidden from the Twilight Dragon. "It's a pity that the Crimson Army did not manage to send the message. Next it's our turn," he sighed. "No one can stop them from entering the heart of the Elven Palace. Cruz's people are done for and Saint Tassol's people are about to bleed to death. Is there any hope for this world? Babel Fortress still has Cruz's people and the elves stationed there. They will not let this happen without doing anything. The attack will not be independent," Brando said. "The Twilight Dragon has been preparing for this for so long. This is the signal for an all-out attack. Babel Fortress is also in danger. We are still here. We will delay them in Candabel for as long as possible." Magadal seemed to have made up her mind. She said firmly, "We will replace Cruz's people and send the message out. This will allow the elves to be on guard." The old man was silent and did not answer directly. But Magadal had already seen the answer from her grandfather's face. "Is it difficult?" "The Crimson Army is 10 times stronger than us, Mary." Magadal clenched her fists. The nun princess thought of many lines in her heart, but she still could not believe that their last hope was lost so easily. There must be a way, right? She could not help but ask, "Then what should we do? Is this it?" "Grandfather, didn't you always say that even in the worst situation, there is always a glimmer of hope?" The old man shook his head. "There is still Brando. He could not do it either. Even his grandfather could not do it." Brando thought to himself. Perhaps the elves and Madara could put aside their differences and allow the undead army to enter. But even then he did not know how much they could save. Moreover, it was not so simple behind the scenes. Even he could not do it? Magadal kept her mouth shut. Perhaps it was because nothing could be changed. At this time, the nun princess' heart calmed down. She did not know why, but at this moment she recalled the conversation she had with Griffin and Vlada Pest. In the small hut, the cheers of the students on the field could be heard from time to time. In the white porcelain cup on the tray, the fragrance of tea rose in spirals. Two girls whispered about their dreams and visions. At that time it was just a simple pursuit, but today it was her best friend who realized it first. Who could say that it was the naivety of a girl? She chased after her own destiny. Thinking back to how she met the people of Abes, it was more like a strange dream. And that person her knight. My best friend, have you achieved your dream? She prayed silently in her heart. Brando suddenly frowned and made a sound of surprise. This made Magadol come back to her senses and looked at her grandfather with some confusion. What's wrong? But the old man did not answer directly and only shook his head slightly. He seemed to have seen this scene before. It was Alkash in the cold wind. Chapter 1501. Beerus' third line of defense has been breached. Sir Laval's battalion is requesting support. Enemy flying units have appeared in the spire of the Lion Beast Dash. They are in the 12 o'clock direction. Veronica's face was cold. The female legion commander gestured to the crossbowman from Adidas not far away. The officer saluted her and rushed to the top of the fortress with the heavily armored crossbowman. Purple arcs of light lit up the sky from time to time, but it was enough to illuminate the entire huge battlefield. Bright spots of light rose and fell one after another, reflecting the light blue network behind it. It was a light curtain about 10 kilometers wide. Behind it, a behemoth had completely risen from the ground and was suspended in mid-air. Its surface was shining with a metallic luster, like a hexahedral prism thousands of meters long. And that was the Tower of Babel. Against the backdrop of this giant tower, the crisscrossing mountains in the Alkash region were like a pocket-sized sand table, and the human defense system was more like a linear distribution of dust. As for the human soldiers who relied on these fortresses to resist, they were almost invisible. However, no matter how small their existence was, when their numbers were enough to cover the entire valley, they still dyed the entire earth with color. On one side of the undulating mountains was the red battlefield of the Cruz people, and on the other side was a turbulent purple sea. The two sides were intertwined. Veronica was watching the crossbowmen moving up the walkway of the city wall from afar. At this distance, more than 60 crossbowmen were as small as a creeping black line. The horseshoe beetles whistled down from the sky, and the crossbowmen had to stop and erect tower shields. From time to time, some of them fell off the city wall. Here, death was nothing more than a common thing. Veronica's heart was calm, as if life and death could no longer make her heart waver. This mechanical indifference shrouded everyone on the battlefield. She frowned and put one hand on her lower abdomen. The scale-like armor was covered with eye-catching rose red, and there was a 6-inch-long fang there. Just a moment later, another light purple arc of light streaked across the sky. The intersecting mountain ridges, as well as the intricate valleys hidden beneath them, the entire world was illuminated by the purple light, down to the finest detail. But a moment later, the world returned to darkness, and the ferocious battlefield disappeared without a trace. The elementalists on the omniscient spire were preparing for a counterattack. Their chanting echoed in the night sky, and bright golden rings of flame appeared above the clouds. A rain of fire appeared in the sky. The golden red flames left a long trail behind them, like molten steel pouring down from the clouds. The sparks fell into the depths of the valley of Alkash. Before the flames landed on the ground, a dense sea of crystal clusters was reflected. They advanced through the sea of fire. He was also trampling on death. Although the crystal clusters had yet to break through the last few lines of defense. But it was not far away. In Wone's history, the defense of a fortress was never isolated. Even the legendary Tower of Babel, which was built by the gods, was the same. However, with the fall of that era, the defensive system built by those great existences had long since disappeared. The glorious history had become the past, buried under the dust. Today it was only covered with scars. Although the Wind Elves and the Cruz people had rebuilt this system. But how could the poor craftsmanship of the mortals be compared to the miracles created by the gods? Babel once had the reputation of never falling, but now no one dared to boast. The defenders all understood one thing. This fortress could be their spiritual support, but in fact, it did not have many trump cards. Veronica stood in place and occasionally looked to the west, where the elf's position was. At this moment, arrows were falling like rain. The Golden Elf archers' powerful dominance on the battlefield effectively stopped the advance of the Crystal Legion army. However, the silhouettes of huge Crystal Legions immediately appeared in the sea of Crystal Legions. The floating purple Crystal Legions began to advance again. The elves were forced to retreat, and gaps appeared in the complete line of defense. The Wind Elves had transferred the most elite Hurricane Corps and the Elven Court Guards from the Wilderness of Four Realms. The former was the archenemy of the Red Army for 6 centuries, while the latter was the Commander's Guard passed down from the Age of the Wise Ones. They used to be the 24 Wind Knight. But the King of Lorendale, the commander of the Wind Elves, Istivil, knew better that he did not have enough power at his disposal. He had no choice but to divert half of the most crucial elven archers to support the human allies, or else the remnants of the green and black legions of the Kurlutzians, which had been painstakingly preserved from East Metz, would bleed to death in this war. This was a consideration on the battlefield, but more importantly the elves valued their promise. Although the two sides had been mortal enemies several times in the past few centuries, the oath engraved on the slate 1,000 years ago also existed. Perhaps on this day when the elves decided to choose such a place to die in battle, they would not hesitate to believe in the people behind them. Even if the other party was the Crew's people. The battle had reached the most white-hot stage. Stormy waves were not enough to describe the offensive of the Crystal Cluster army. The human fortresses that were still standing at the forefront fell one by one. The knight who sent the order was reading out the names of the troops that had not fallen yet, but the list was getting shorter and shorter. Sir Marks and his Highland Infantry Battalion have asked for help. Sir Spruce is still there. Swordmaster Wade and his battalion are retreating. Parchments were thrown on the aisle one by one. Finally, there was one last parchment left in his bony hand. At this moment the third line of defense had collapsed. But there was one last reef in the midst of the raging waves. Sir Vala is still there. Sir Vala and the others have retreated into Fort Golden Falcon. When he read it for the third time, the knight looked up in shock and said in a trembling voice, "Sir Laval? Sir Laval and the others are still there." Many people were stunned. In the Latch of Wa there was a place called the Shetty. A brown river flowed through this place. On that fertile land, there was a group of people who had fought against the mountain people for generations. They were the descendants of the Crew's people, but they were not accepted into the mainstream society of the Empire. The Shetty people liked to ridicule the Empire people for being petty because they were the descendants of the warriors. And for decades, every Shetty person hated the Empire for betraying them. The Empire tolerated the mountain people but forgot the Shetty people. Count Laval was a Shetty person. He was stubborn, old-fashioned, and dogmatic. He was not accepted by the upper classes. What was more irritating was that he was a so-called dissident. In short, he was a loyal follower of Queen Constance. Such a person was naturally disliked everywhere, not to mention after the fall of Constance. If the Empire had not fallen, such a person would have been stripped of his noble status, perhaps even hanged. Duke Ludwig had mocked him for being insensible, and the nobles who had suffered losses in the war at East Metz were even more furious. They had more than once publicly declared that the Shetty farmers were a gang of barbarians. But the Shetty people were brave and good at fighting, and the region had historically produced the best archers and light infantry in the Empire. In the center of the battlefield, the Shetty people retreated into the Barbican when the Shetty had climbed up the outer wall. The Shetty people had defended the Barbican to the death. When the inner wall had fallen, the Shetty people had retreated into the steeple. There were not many of them left, but the steeple was still standing. It was like a sharp tooth piercing into the purple sea. Duke Ludwig instinctively approached the battlements. "What are you waiting for? Go and save them." His veins bulged like an angry lion as he roared at his knight. A hand interrupted him. Mangrove looked at the knight who had sent the order. The knight's voice was a little stiff. "Sir Laval and his soldiers have requested for support. What kind of support do they need?" "My lord, see for yourself." A small figure climbed to the top of the spire and raised a flag on the top of the spire. "It's Sir Laval," someone exclaimed. But more people stared at the flag in silence. It was a brown flag in the shape of a piece of land. It was the land that the Shetty people had guarded for generations, their homeland, the fertile land surrounded by brown rivers. The brown white-bellied falcon represented the fearless spirit of the Shetty people, and the ears of rice contained the deepest hope of the land. Under the ears of rice, a lion held a skylark in its mouth, and the Shetty people were also loyal and trustworthy. It was a raging purple wave. It was also a lonely flag. Many people shed tears, feeling regret for what they had done in the past. These farmers from the Shetty people had proved their loyalty and bravery to the Empire, but the Empire could no longer make up for its narrowness and prejudice. Perhaps this was the root of everything that had fallen apart. At this moment, Mangrove suddenly thought of the small border country in the south of the Empire, the fearless king, and the sword that he had taken away. Duke Ludwig leaned weakly against the wall and remained silent. "They request to use the Golden Flame Angel." The knight who had sent the order replied in a low voice. "Target?" Mangrove asked softly. The knight who had sent the order opened his mouth, but in fact, everyone already knew the answer. Like a king who needed both a scepter and a sword to maintain his dignity, The golden flame angel was Babel's sword that symbolized justice and dignity. The golden light gathered from the bottom to the top along the hexagonal prism. They might have traveled for several kilometers, but in fact, it only took a moment for them to gather at one point. The sky seemed to have been lit up, and the clouds were burning fiercely. A fiery red light shot down from the top, straight into the dark mountains, and then scattered into tens of thousands of light beams, plowing through the sea of crystal clusters. With just one blow, tens of thousands of crystal clusters were turned into ashes. The attack of the entire purple sea was stopped. But in the center of the light beam, only the scorched remains of the towering spire were left. The flag turned into ashes and drifted away in the breeze before dawn. Some noble ladies even covered their faces and cried out. Their cries echoed on the city wall, but they could not suppress the earth-shattering battle. The golden flame angel should not have been used at this time, but people knew that only the bravest deserved a sword. The Shetty people had proved their bravery. When Mangrove walked down the city wall, he patted his old friend on the shoulder, which meant to tell Duke Ludwig. Many people would die here, but those who survived would have to fight on. In the Spire of the Lion, a battle that had no suspense was coming to an end. Humans had no hope of winning. The young officer from Adidas stood on the city wall and saluted to his commander from afar with a knight's salute. The officer's eyes were filled with a kind of heartfelt respect. Then he jumped and landed on the cliff. Countless locusts were climbing up the city wall. Veronica looked at the scene expressionlessly. "It's time to retreat," Mephisto told her. "I can't even remember his name, but I know that child is a knight of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment," she whispered to the Ash Sword Saint. "They are the best young people in the Empire." "I know them." Mephisto knew his former enemies. "They are worthy of admiration. Bring me my horse. I'm going to see Istowel." With that, she turned and walked away. Mephisto grabbed her arm and shook his head. "Why bother? You know it won't work out. The elves also have their difficulties. Besides, you are still injured. We may all die here." "This injury is nothing," Veronica replied softly. "Do you want me to give up? We can still retreat now, but there will be nowhere to retreat." Yeruda stared blankly at the mess left behind after the dispute. The table was overturned to the ground, parchments and map cylinders rolled to the ground. The elven guard stood awkwardly at the door, not knowing whether to advance or retreat. The King of Lorendale, who was wearing a black velvet coat and had a thin face, shook his head. He bent down to pick up the military map from the ground. His skinny palm was as pale as a vampire's. The face of the elven lord could be described as withered. His deep-set eyes seemed to contain a bright flame, but his lips were extremely thin, as if he was indifferent and extremely opinionated. Istowel smiled bitterly again and shook the dust off the parchment in his hand. The fury of the female army commander left a deep impression on everyone present, but he just did not expect that after so many years, she still had the same temper as when she was a little girl. "Why didn't you agree with her?" Yeruda finally could not help but ask. Although he was a little afraid of the person in front of him, he did not show his emotions. "Why should I agree?" Istowel looked at the young crown prince and asked. "Isn't this self-saving, at this time?" "What is self-saving?" Istowel asked. "Relying on Madara?" But the sage said. The King of Lorendale raised his hand to signal that he did not need to say any more. "Your Royal Highness, compared to the sages living in history, I know what Saint Tossel needs better than them." "Well, this problem is too complicated for you. Maybe you should spend more time learning how to be an elven crown prince." The guards outside the door heard the words and looked at each other, thinking that the king was talking nonsense again. This time it involved the Wind Empress, and he was not very respectful to his Royal Highness. But fortunately, perhaps they had been accustomed to such a scene for a long time. They carefully gave each other a look, and the elven girls quietly retreated. Perhaps others could pretend not to hear this sentence, but Yeruda could not. He felt insulted. He was just the son of a hunter, and he had suffered enough these days. The elves did not put him and his sister in their eyes at all. Some people even mocked them as bumpkins. He took off the crown from his head and could not help but say loudly, "I know you don't think highly of us at all, but I didn't expect anything. If it weren't for Mr. Brando and the Sage's commission, I wouldn't have thought of coming here. If you want this crown, take it. It doesn't belong to me." With that, he threw the crown in his hand to the other party. Istowel suddenly stopped and did not reach out to catch it. The crown fell to the ground with a thud. Outside the window, a purple arc of light was crossing the sky, and the whole dark room was lit up. Yeruda was startled. He looked at the rolling crown and remembered that it was the symbol of the elven kingship. He could not help but be a little scared and whispered, I didn't mean it. The king of Lorendale glanced at him, bent down, and picked up the crown with both hands. Don't let me hear that again, he said coldly. Then why do you have to keep us here? Yeruda felt a tingling in his nose, and tears were almost rolling in his eyes. He was really aggrieved and scared. Since you don't want to let us go back. My sister and I are not elves. Because you don't understand its weight. Istowel gently swept away the dust on the crown. Then he raised the crown with both hands and put it on the top of the boy's head. Yeruda was still in tears and froze when he saw the other party coming over. But when he saw Istowel's movements, he was stunned for a moment. I do know more about the current Saint Tossel than the Wind Empress. But I have to admit that she knows better than me who is more suitable for the king. Istowel looked very serious. The Wind Elves have long lacked a culture of tolerance, so they are not accepted in the mainstream of civilization. Perhaps a human king is the opportunity to change everything. Guarding alone is just a helpless choice, especially today. In fact, we all know that no one can face this enemy alone. In that case, why don't you agree? Yeruda wiped his tears and sniffed. You clearly know that Madara is not behind the White Mountain. I'm sorry, I overheard your conversation. Istowel did not take it seriously and corrected Yeruda's words seriously. Sus not you. The elven lord looked out of the window, the light reflected in the depths of his pupils on his thin face. Outside the window, dark clouds hung low. In the sky, the aerial knights of the Kurlutz and the Farnazane had also joined the battle. The battle was extremely intense, the light of magic almost lighting up the entire cloud layer. 1,000 years ago it was also the same situation, he muttered to himself. Then he turned back. Your Highness, have you understood the foundation of the Wind Elves? Yeruda shook his head blankly. It's because of pride. But Istowel's tone was even more proud. Pride. Those in this world who think they are above people, the Wind Elves will never accept their manipulation. He reached out and straightened Yeruda's crown. Not in the past, so not today. Yeruda was stunned. He felt as if he understood something, but he was not sure. Chapter 1502. When Vahaina opened the door and entered the room, Delphian, the daughter of the Prime Minister, was writing something on the table. The room in the fortress was not spacious. It looked like a silver hexagonal beehive with a concave bed on one side of the wall. The desk was made of metal and there was a chair beside it. The Prime Minister's daughter on the chair was wearing a wrinkled long black dress. She was wearing a long black dress that dragged along the silver floor. Her figure was graceful and her long hair was like black sandalwood. Her entire body exuded a fatal attraction, but she was more like a black widow spider. When she saw Vahaina, she put the quill back into the ink bottle and looked up. What's wrong? It took a lot of effort to coax Elise to sleep. She's scared. Vahaina gently closed the door and answered. Everyone is scared, especially in times like this. Delphian picked up the parchment on the table and rolled it into a cylinder. But at least she has a good sister. She put the scroll into the cylinder and closed the lid. She then looked at Vahaina and sized her friend up. You've changed a lot. Vahaina's expression was calm. She was only wearing a simple military corset, and her blonde hair was tied up behind her head. She looked more like an ordinary female knight than the heiress of Mehodafen. After going through so many things, the arrogant and unruly young lady no longer had the air of arrogance. She had learned to be mature and tolerant. When she heard the Prime Minister's daughter's words, she forced a smile. Thank you. I was too childish in the past. Delphian put the cylinder on the table and gestured for Vahaina to sit down. How's the situation outside? I've been writing all this while. I heard that the crystal cluster's attack is fierce. It's bad. They seem to be endless. Our forces are already stretched thin. Vahaina nodded. Most of us are leaning towards retreating, but your grandfather and Lord Vala have not made a decision. As for the civilians who came with us, Mr. Nydevan has decided to evacuate them to the Loven Forest. My father is not a man of great importance, but he's more than capable of being a civil officer. Delphian mocked with a slight smile. She then changed her tone and said seriously, but the civilians can leave, but the others must stay here. Oh, and other than the elderly and women, the young and strong among the civilians must stay as well. Vahaina looked at her in surprise. But the generals think that the Acropolis outside the fortress can last for 3 days at most. If we're trapped in the fortress, we'll be trapped to death. Delphian seemed to have expected Vahaina's surprise and smiled. It's not that serious. Our main problem now is that the undead army of Madara can't reach us. That's why our forces are stretched thin. And it just so happens that something as serious as the disaster of White Mountain happened at this time. The elves sealed the borders and the army and Madara confronted each other at the border. That's why the problem seems to have become a dead knot. But it's just a seeming, and not a real, dead knot, because everyone knows, including the elven court itself, that the root of the problem is not the undead, but the Bugas. Perhaps very few people have told you that there has always been a serious disagreement between our world and the Silver Folk. It's not difficult to find this when you look back at history. On the one hand, the weak mortals occupy the main resources on the continent, while the excellent and powerful Silver Folk can only choose to hide. On the other hand, the mortals themselves also have such an inferiority complex. We subconsciously fear the power of the Silver Folk. This suspicion has been around for a long time, even since the era of the War of the Holy Saints. And today, the distrust of the Bugas towards the mortals has deepened the contradiction. It can be said that the Bugas have never really trusted the mortals. They pretend to be guardians, monitoring the chaotic border of the world, living above the clouds, and intervening in the disputes of the mortal world with a high and mighty attitude. More importantly, they have their own way of doing things and attitude, and we have never really understood what those wizards want to do, so we can't judge whether their attitude is good or bad. In fact, it is this attitude that has touched the sensitive nerves of the mortals, because whether it is the Cruise people or the Wind Elves, they have achieved their status through resistance. We will never allow the fact that the Dark Dragon is above the mortals to appear again, and the shadow of the Bugas behind the disaster of White Mountain has only magnified this uneasiness and put all the contradictions on the table. So to untie this knot and let Saint Tassol and Madara return to the negotiating table, we just have to change the attitude of the Bugas, and find the real mastermind behind the disaster of White Mountain. Vahina shook her head. But even if Saint Tassol and Madara return to the negotiating table now, it's too late. She sighed again. We don't have that much time. Of course there is. Delphian blinked. Do you trust me? Vahina was already full of admiration for her friend's wisdom. She nodded subconsciously but then said with some difficulty. But the decision of the nobles is not that easy to influence. If they see no hope, I'm afraid your grandfather and my father will make a decision. Then before they make a decision we have to change everything. Vahina could not help but widen her eyes. Changing the decision of the noble assembly, was that something they could interfere with? If it was not for the fact that the person sitting in front of her was the flower of the empire, famous for her wisdom, and the eldest daughter of generations of Nidevan, Vahina would have thought that her friend had gone mad. Delphian was not afraid at all. She spoke frankly. It's difficult for the average person, but you and I have a natural advantage at this moment. To change the decision of the nobles, we only need to win over a few voices with real weight. The Duke of Mehodafen, the Prime Minister of the Empire, the Great Holy See Vala, represent the local, central and holy sanctum respectively. Plus your teacher, Madame Veronica, if the military is on our side, what can the rest of them decide? Vahina shook her head. I wouldn't dare to say that. Our fathers would never listen to our nonsense. That's not necessarily true. Delphian's lips curled into a sly smile. By the way, how's the matter I asked you to do? Vahina looked at Delphian strangely and shook her head. I've asked father about it for you. He said he has never seen the ring, but he seems to be very angry and told me not to interfere. There was a hint of doubt in her blue eyes. Delphian, do you know something? Is the ring important? My father seems to be very concerned about it. Delphian did not answer directly. Instead she asked, what about the other nobles? No, they have never seen the ring. The Great Holy See did not mention it either. Delphian's face finally showed a strange smile. Vahina, I've asked Vala and my grandfather. Guess what they said? Vahina looked at her in confusion. Of course they don't dare to answer. Delphian smiled coldly. Vahina, I'll tell you. The ring is the symbol of the Empire's highest authority, the sacred ring of fire, the symbol of Cruz's throne. It did not go missing with Queen Constance's death. I'm very sure it's in my grandfather's hands. What? Vahina was shocked when she heard Delphian's words. Delphian was much calmer. In the Empire, there is only one way to change the decision of the Noble Council. That is His Majesty's decree. But Prince Leneret is not the Emperor of the Empire yet. For the time being, the sacred ring of fire can represent the Empire's highest authority. But Delphine, the sacred ring of fire is just a ring. While it carries the agreement between the nobles and the royal family, the token itself does not represent the Kurlutz emperor. Only when the heir to the throne of Kurlutz holds it will the agreement be binding. Don't forget that, Vahina was no stranger to the secret code between the royal family and the nobles and quickly found a loophole and reminded her friend, I remember that Queen Constance did not appoint any prince to inherit the crown of the empire before she died, so even His Royal Highness, the eldest son of the Kurlutz emperor, had to fulfill the Golden Flame ritual contract before he could inherit the throne. No, Vahina. Her Majesty had appointed a successor before she died. Delphian replied calmly. What? How is that possible? Vahina blurted out. Her beautiful eyes were filled with disbelief. Wasn't it rumored that she plotted to kill all the successors? Prince Leneret only managed to escape because he took refuge in Erewhon. I saw it with my own eyes, Delphian said confidently. But of course she did not see it with her own eyes. She stood far away when Her Majesty entrusted her son to her. It was just a guess in her heart. Of course she was now sure that her guess was accurate. Her Majesty had appointed a successor before she died. According to the agreement between the nobles and the king, she handed the ring to Great Saint Vala and my grandfather for safekeeping. Vahina was puzzled. You mean they hid Her Majesty's will? But that's unbelievable. Delphian, can I be sure that everything you said is true? Delphian showed a look of disdain. The reason is simple. The successor appointed by Her Majesty Constance is not anyone from the royal bloodline. Even though Vahina tried her best to hold it in, she could not help but cry out when she heard the news. She asked her friend with a trembling voice. Delphian, the successor appointed by Her Majesty, could it be you? Delphian covered her mouth and chuckled. She could not help but laugh. What are you thinking? You know this person too. He is not Her Majesty's political ally. On the contrary, they are enemies. Vahina frowned. The Queen of Silver had too many enemies. She couldn't even count all of them in the empire, not to mention the vast sea outside the empire. How was she supposed to guess? But for some reason the first person that appeared in her mind was someone from Erewhon. She subconsciously looked at the Prime Minister's daughter. Delphian smiled. Perhaps it is the person you are thinking of. I've never thought of such a person. Vahina hurriedly defended herself without thinking. But the moment she spoke, she realized that something was wrong. Her face immediately turned red. She lowered her head, looking like an ostrich. The Prime Minister's daughter could not help but smile. But when she thought of her own ridiculous actions, she could not smile anymore. Her Majesty. Why would she choose Mr. Brando? Even though he is a count, he is still a noble of Erewhon. Vahina could not help but ask. Because from a certain point of view, Her Majesty is more far-sighted than any of us. Delphian also sorted out her emotions. A glimmer of light flashed in her light purple eyes. That was the kind of person she admired the most. Changing the decision of the nobles of Cruz is just the beginning. The Wind Elves, Fanzan, Madara's envoy, and the nobles of the Silver Cove who may arrive at any time. In order to convince everyone that there is still hope to defend this fortress, we must balance the forces of all sides. This is almost an impossible task, but there is still a possibility. The royal siblings of Saint Tassol, although their identities are rarely known, but at the critical moment, they will definitely be swayed by that person's opinion. And the old white wolf of Silver Cove and now the nun princess, are even closer to him. The attitude of the druids of Alaranta has long been known. And there is also a well-known fact that is, the silver folk also support him. He's the only one who can fuse these fragmented powers together. Now all he needs is a stage. In fact, Her Majesty has already given him the key to this stage. That is the highest laurel of the Cruz Empire. She personally gave it away. That may be the last hope she left for the world. Delphian was silent. 1,440 years ago, the dwarf king Caliphan abandoned the covenant and withdrew from the holy alliance with the Temple of Earth. 1,130 years ago, the Hazel people and the four holy cathedrals announced a break. 1,000 years ago, the four holy cathedrals successively established their country. From that moment on, the sacred oath was no more. The covenant of the seven kings had long since ceased to exist. But perhaps on the sacred White Plains, the people may one day gather again, and when they choose the holy king with the sword, a new era will begin. That time he will be the Flame King Gretel. And this time, what kind of name will be engraved on the azure stone tablet? She clenched her fists. Vahina, we must fulfill Her Majesty's last wish and let the holy ring of fire find its rightful owner, Delphian told her friend seriously. but I have to do something, so you must convince your father, my grandfather Veronica, and Mangrove to support this matter. Meh. Vahina pointed at herself, extremely surprised. How can I do that? Besides, what about His Highness Leneret? That is his throne, aren't we going too far? And there are many nobles in Ludwig who support him, including General Mangrove. They will not support us. But they must support the Holy Ring of Fire. The nobles will not go against the agreement. Delphian smiled mysteriously. And this is not a plot to seize the throne, we are just borrowing it for a period of time, all for the sake of justice. I believe the Crown Prince will understand. Really? Vahina was a little doubtful, but she did not think that her friend would lie to her, not to mention that she did not know what was going on in the head of the Prime Minister's daughter. This is the agreement, Delphian winked playfully at her, and don't worry, I will convince His Highness Leneret. Vahina was silent for a moment, but she finally made up her mind. She looked up and asked, Then what should I do? Delphian smiled, revealing her fox tail. You have the secret of the Holy Ring of Fire. As long as you can convince your father, my grandfather, and the great Holy See Vala, you can use the ring to influence the noble's decision. Although I believe my grandfather and the great Holy See are hesitant, you must understand that an agreement is an agreement. They will compromise. Then there is the Wind Elves. The elves keep their promises. If Krush chooses to stand firm, the Wind Elves will most likely not sit idly by. Most importantly, although the royal siblings have not exerted any influence on this negotiation, they have the power to make the final decision. The elves will not go against the will of the Ring of the Wind Empress. If you can represent the Count, I believe they will make their own choice. Vahina took a deep breath when she heard this. She never dreamed that in this small room in just a few moments she and her good friend had discussed such a huge conspiracy. This was not only a fight for the throne, but also the future of the continent. If what Delphian said was true, then did it not mean that they had decided the fate of countless people in just a few moments? Vahina could not help but re-evaluate her friend, as if she wanted to see how much ambition was hidden in her. What about you, Delphian? What are you going to do? Of course, to live up to your expectations. Didn't I say before? Delphine replied with a smile. That's what I'm going to do. At that moment there was a rhythmic knock on the door. Delphian looked up. It seems that the person I have been waiting for is here, she said. Vahina turned around and saw an unfamiliar lady standing outside the door. She was very tall, much taller than most men. She wore a long silver robe and held a staff in her hand. Her bright silver hair casually draped over her body. You're here, Mistress Mithril, Delphian said apologetically. I'm sorry about what happened to Mr. Rajak. That has nothing to do with you, the silver dragon sighed. Everyone can die in this war, and I believe that my lover died a worthy death. She paused for a moment, then spoke again. Let's go, Leviathan has already entered the battlefield. If we are any later, it will be difficult for us to leave this place. Delphian nodded, picked up the letter on the table and stood up. Thank you for your trouble, Mistress Mithril. Vahina, we will meet on the White Plains. Take care, my friend. Chapter 1503. Behemoths walk in the northern wilderness, guarding the secrets of the ancient land. The crystal clusters were coming from all directions. Hippamera stood in the middle of the hill, her face fearless. She took a step back and slapped the ground with her hand. The silver stone gauntlet covering her right arm turned into water and flowed into the ground, forming a huge magic circle. A deafening roar came from the mountain path and the ground shook. A rune stone colossus broke out from the ground. This elemental creature violently swept its hand, and the crystal clusters that were charging at the front immediately fell off the cliff or were sent flying into the air, shattering into pieces. Secret stone armor. 20 cost colorless divine equipment, +6/+6 equip. When equipped with this equipment, the creature has the ability of immortality. Shuffle this equipment into the graveyard, search for a creature whose cost does not exceed this card, and put it into play. The power of the 88 runestone colossus was almost equivalent to a creature at the peak of elemental activation, and it controlled the highest elemental stone, earth. It roared into the sky and countless stone spikes sprouted out of the ground like bamboo shoots after a rain. The purple sea above the mountain path was emptied. But Hippamera did not slack off. Stone. She ordered her summoned creature to put down its arm, and rushed along its arm all the way to the top of the colossus' head. She jumped up high, and when she landed, her feet touched the sharp rocks. The earth seemed to listen to the command of the priestess, and pushed her forward like a wave, passing over the heads of the crystal clusters. Just as she passed by the area, a purple flash appeared behind her, and a giant crystal cluster behemoth fell out of the rift created by the teleportation, and fell into this world. Be careful of the secret crystal lords, they are proficient in long-range attacks. You better hurry, there are more of them. The huge shadow of the seven-pole dragon king, Wuxia, covered half the sky and hovered between the peaks, almost as tall as the entire sacred mountain. 7 long horns pierced the sky, and she raised her head and gave a warning. Several purple arcs of light had already streaked across the valley, piercing through the runestone colossus. Hipamera revealed the last artifact card in her hand. Sacred Artifact of Transference. Negate all protection. Counterattack when any player casts a spell and add a transference counter to the sacred artifact. When the counter reaches 3, remove the transference counter and sacrifice it. Search your deck for an artifact card, put it onto the battlefield and equip it on a creature you control. Then shuffle your deck. The arcs of light hit a pale white light barrier. Then, the same number of arcs of light shot out from the light barrier at the same time, flying towards their origin. A few secret crystal lords were immediately devoured by the grayish-white flames, turning into a pile of gray powder in an instant. Hipamera had just landed on the ground, and the many crystal clusters behind her had already turned into fragments. She raised her hand, and the runestone colossus in the center of the battlefield let out a wail and fell to the ground. Under the attack of the many crystal clusters, it shattered into pieces. However, a beam of white light shot out from its wreckage, crossing half of the battlefield in an arc and landing in the hands of the priestess. It was a huge sword burning with blazing white flames. When the runestone colossus enters the graveyard, search the graveyard for an artifact card, put it onto the battlefield and equip it on a creature you control. It was the Tianming sword. 22 cost, colorless artifact. The creature wearing this artifact gets +2/+2 and has anti-white protection and anti-black protection abilities. Whenever the creature wearing this artifact deals combat damage to the target, its owner gains 3 HP, and you can transfer up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Hipamera held the sacred sword in her hand, and her strength was close to the late stage of the elemental enlightenment after the buff. At the same time, the sacred artifact of transference in the air had turned into a pool of silver liquid. It changed its shape and formed a set of silver armor that covered her body. Ancient silver armor. The creature wearing this artifact gets +6/+6. Whenever the creature wearing this artifact attacks, the target non-lord creature will be destroyed. The peak of the sacred mountain was already in sight. Hipamera raised her head, knowing that the final battle was in front of her. A huge creature was taking shape. It was a huge whale that cruised through the mountains. Its huge fins could cover half the mountainside, and its gray skin was covered with tumor-like crystalline protrusions. On its spindle-shaped head, a long crystal horn pointed towards the sky. The Leviathan's heir. Although it was not the true Lord of Chaos, it was the most powerful of all the lords. Facing such a monster, even Hipamera could not help but change her expression. Why would there be such a creature in this place? Countless crystal shards fell from the sky, and the moment these crystals left the body of the whale, they turned into countless crystal worms. These were the Kaigura crystal worms, the vanguard of the crystal worm army. They attacked as soon as they took shape. These monsters were not powerful, but their numbers were shocking. Hipamera looked up. Half the sky was an eye-catching purple-red, like a flowing crystal river. She took a step back and waved her hand. A shining silver eagle immediately shot out from her hand and into the clouds. A moment later, pieces of silver light fell from the clouds, whistling through the sky. It was a group of silver eagles swooping down from the clouds. Eagle Squadron. When the Eagle Squadron enters the battlefield, you can search your deck for up to 3 cards named Eagle Squadron. Reveal these cards, place them in your hand and shuffle your deck. The huge group of eagles was like a silver arrow that stretched across the sky. It made a huge turn in the air and then bit down on the purple-red river. The giant eagles and the Kaigura crystal worms fought each other, and the two sides clashed, causing corpses to fall like rain. After the torrent of amethyst in the sky was split by the silver arrow, it formed 2 thin lines that crossed Hipamera. Although there were still crystal worms that whistled past her head from time to time, these weak creatures could not pose any threat to the priestess. Hipamera gripped the Tianming sword tightly. With the support of the ancient silver armor, her current strength was infinitely close to the pinnacle state. Those fishes that slipped through her net were nothing more than dust to her. With a sweep of her giant sword, they were reduced to ashes. Hipamera continued to release the Eagle Squadron as she advanced, although there were only 4 Eagle Squadrons in a deck. However, the Tianming sword's ability to return to the graveyard continuously pulled them back to the battlefield. Very quickly she was already extremely close to the giant whale. "Keep going," Fuchsia's voice boomed from the sky. "Behind that monster is the peak of the sacred mountain. The core of the legacy lies within the sacred temple." Without saying a word, Hippamera stepped onto the edge of the cliff. She swung her sword and hacked the crystal cluster that was pouncing at her face, then leaped up and spread out a pair of metal wings behind her. It was a divine artifact creature, a vibrator. She grabbed the frame of the vibrator and slowly glided towards the giant whale in the valley. The descendant of the Leviathan seemed to have sensed her intentions. It let out a low roar and swung its tail towards Hippamera. However, as soon as the vibrator flew up, it barely missed the whale's tail. However, the airflow brought about by the whale's tail caused her to fly up and down. Hippamera had no choice but to let go of the vibrator and land heavily on the back of the giant whale from a height of a few hundred meters. The Leviathan was neither dead nor alive, but legend had it that its race was always alone. In the boundless sea of chaos, ever since the beginning of the world, only one Leviathan had ever been born. It was the true ruler of chaos. It had the ability to imprison all powers, elements, and energy. Even elements and laws themselves would be locked down. The offspring of Leviathan, or rather, the projection of the behemoth in the material world, did not have this ability, but it was enough to make most of the elements lose their effects. There was also an anti-magic area around its huge body, which was dozens of miles wide. The spells of mortals could not work here at all. But there was only one ability that the creatures of chaos could never control. And that was the power of a planeswalker. Every planeswalker comes from a legacy. There will never be more or less planeswalkers in this world. Different legacies may be absent in a certain era, but they will one day reappear in this world. One of the legacies has been absent for a long time, but I can see the same flame and light in you. Hippamera raised her sword and let out a roar as she thrust it towards the central nervous system of the Leviathan. The sacred swordsman did not even manage to penetrate the crystalline layer of the Leviathan's descendant's back, but the planeswalker's flames had already burned through its entire body. The Leviathan roared and shook its body. The crystals on its back that looked like lumps fell off like mountains, revealing the smooth surface underneath. The priestess shouted again. It was hard to believe that such a quiet lady could make such a wild shout. She threw out a Phyrexia Metamorphosis demon. This terrifying creature could become a replica of any divine artifact or creature on the battlefield. Hippamera caught the Phyrexia Metamorphosis demon and turned it into another Tianming sword. Then she swung it down heavily. With another boost, Hippamera's power level had risen to the middle of the Supreme Realm in an instant. This slash caused the skin on the Leviathan's descendant's back to split open, but it did not bleed. Only gray mist gushed out from the wound. This time the whale's roar was more like a wail. Under the intense pain, it crashed into the sacred mountain. A bright green net of light appeared from the front to the back of the mountain where the storm stopped. When the giant beast collided with the net, a miracle happened. Its entire body shattered like a crystal, instantly shattering into pieces. The power of imprisonment that shrouded the entire valley disappeared in an instant. Hippamera immediately felt the supreme realm returning to her body. She fell from the Leviathan's descendant's back, but now she could finally stabilize herself. The last obstacle had disappeared. The Keydra crystals that were flying in the air were flying around like headless flies, but the priestess ignored them. She flew against the cold wind towards the sacred temple. But at this time, the towering mountain of ceasing storms suddenly turned into a mist. The cold wind disappeared, and the surroundings seemed to have fallen into a dark space. Hippamera felt her feet touch solid ground in the next moment. She was stunned for a moment before she saw the mist in front of her. And in front of her, there was a golden card floating in the darkness. Looking at the card, Hippamera seemed to understand something. She silently walked up and reached out to the card. But the next moment, what she held in her hand was not a card. It was a sharp sword that was entwined with black and green light. The Sword of Fongling. 21 cost colorless divine equipment. Creatures who wear this equipment will gain +2/+2 and have anti-black and anti-green protection. Whenever a creature wearing this equipment causes combat damage to an enemy, all lands under your control will be reset. This sword, when Hippamera saw the sword, she could not help but be stunned. In the darkness, Fuchsia's figure appeared. She had transformed into a black-haired woman wearing a black robe and a crown. Her appearance could not be said to be beautiful, but it was so majestic that it was suffocating. Especially that pair of eyes that burned with golden flames. You should recognize it. This is the sword of famine, Lorenshire, the divine equipment of Himalud. But it also has another origin. When the Azure Knight called out the names of Himalud and Gaia in the mountains and searched for the Azure Lance, it was the goddess who gave him this sword. It was not for him to break through all the obstacles and finally gain the favor of the heavens. Fuchsia quietly narrated, but it is not just a sword but a legacy. It is very different from the Truth Society and the Arbiters. The Planeswalker legacy of the Azure Knight comes from the organization of Gaia. It is a rare Planeswalker legacy with the duty of guarding. Since the era of the Azure Knight, it has not had a second successor, until today. This is my Planeswalker legacy? Epamera asked with a little surprise. She repeatedly observed the sword in her hand. It was the sacred item of the goddess she worshipped. Everything was so compatible. It is called the Majestic Mountain Armament. It is a set of rare equipment cards. Not only can it protect you, but it can also protect your Planeswalker master. Its power, I believe you have already experienced it. Fuchsia replied. Can I take it with me? Of course, it is already yours. Epamera took a while to calm down. She silently turned the sword into a golden card, and then watched the card disappear in her hand. She was wounded all over. Her face, her body were all red with blood. The wounds were painful, but at this moment, her heart was unusually calm. Some of the things that she believed in were like towering mountains that reached into the clouds, possessing a broad and comforting power. Epamera raised her head. There were still some doubts in her heart. The crystal clusters that appeared in the illusion did not seem to be real projections. Especially the few Lord-class creatures that appeared at the end, their power was obviously incompatible with the illusions she encountered at the beginning of the illusion. What happened outside? Where is Medisha? She will be out in a moment. Fuchsia answered. Before she finished speaking, the silhouette of the silver elf princess appeared in the darkness. Epamera couldn't help but widen her eyes. What she saw was a head full of long hair that flowed down to her ankles, so beautiful that it made people jealous. The elf princess was barefooted, her silver eyes empty. She held a silver spear in her hands and was in a daze. Medisha? The priestess did not dare to recognize her. In the past, Medisha looked like a young princess, but now she looked like an elegant goddess. Fuchsia gently pressed Epamera's shoulder. Don't disturb her. She is not like you. She used to be an undead. The Planeswalker's legacy has completely changed her nature. You mean Miss Medisha has truly come back to life? Epamera asked excitedly. If the Lord knew about this, he would be overjoyed. It's much more complicated than that. A Planeswalker's power doesn't matter if she's dead or alive. She nodded in the end. But you can basically say that she's a real Planeswalker like you. Miss Divine Official couldn't help but take a deep breath, revealing a happy smile. At this time, Medisha finally snapped out of her daze. Her ethereal eyes regained their luster. She noticed the changes in her body and subconsciously looked at her hands. When she saw that her pure white fingertips were no longer that intimidating snow white, and that her sparkling skin revealed a trace of healthy red color, tears involuntarily slid down her cheeks. Medisha wiped her tears and turned around. Lady Fuchsia, why did the dusk species appear in this place? They are not projections, right? Epamera couldn't help but be startled. She didn't expect Medisa to encounter a dusk species. Could it be that the monsters in the illusion were not illusions? She subconsciously looked at Fuchsia. The Seven Dragon King nodded. That is indeed the case. Did something happen outside, Lord Dragon King? Take a look for yourselves. Fuchsia waved her hand and a large crystal ball appeared in the darkness. She tapped on the crystal ball and all kinds of images appeared on it. Epamera and Medisha recognized that it was the scenery outside the elemental boundary. There was a shallow sea, a scorching river, and even a mountain where the storm stopped. However, these places were no longer the same as before. The shallow sea was torn apart by a powerful force, and the water elemental and seawater were flowing into the void. Part of the seawater flowed into the scorching river, causing the fire elemental realm to be engulfed in a sea of mist. At the bottom of the elemental realm, the scorching river had dried up, and the lava had cooled to a black color. The mountain where the storm stopped seemed to have broken down from the middle. The wind elemental wyverns that once lived here were nowhere to be seen. The shattered mountain range floated in the void. As for the wind, it had stopped long ago. Only purple lightning could be seen flashing between the gray, lifeless rocks. Since the fall of the black moon, the elemental realm had long collapsed. The creatures that used to live in the elemental realm, especially the fairies and other elemental creatures, had long fled to the inner world. It was a well-known fact that the elemental realm had become a cage that sealed the dusk dragon. However, Hipamera and Medisha did not understand why Fuchsia showed them this thing. Medisha frowned. She looked at it for a while and noticed something strange. "Where's the yellow dusk dragon?" she asked. "Isn't it there? My lord and sage Eloranta personally sealed it in that place." Hipamera suddenly stopped talking. She could not see anything in front of her. "The dusk dragon has broken the seal?" Medisha suddenly thought of a terrifying possibility, but she still could not believe it. "That seal can bind it for at least 3 years, right? How can this be?" "Don't worry, its body has not completely left," Fuchsia shook her head and replied, "but someone has once again awakened its body in the material realm." There are really countless moles among the mortals? Miss Roman." Medisha suddenly remembered something and could not help but exclaim. Although the dusk dragon's body was sealed outside the elemental realm, its other body, the merchant lady, had always been in the material realm. Everyone had neglected this fact. "Can you find her, Dragon King?" Hipamera could not help but ask anxiously. No one wanted to see the dusk dragon roaming the world without fear, even though the merchant lady herself did not have much power. This time, Fuchsia shook her head and replied, "Since she has sneaked into our world, it is obvious that she will not let us find out so easily. But the dusk species you encountered before is indeed related to this matter." She pointed outside the elemental realm and said, "Although I do not know what this fellow is up to, the Sea of Chaos has begun to stir. The Dusk Army is attacking Wone from all directions without any regard for the cost. With this level of attack, the forces of chaos that have infiltrated the elemental realm are not small. We are only the beginning. I believe that the continent has already turned upside down." "Then we must return to my lord's side immediately," Medisha immediately reacted. "Erwin might be in trouble too." Hearing this, Hipamela immediately nodded her head, obviously eager to return home. Fuchsia looked at the two of them and hesitated for a moment, but finally nodded. "It seems that it is necessary. In a sense, you are my students. I will go with you." Chapter 1504. November, the month of frost. Cold winds howled across the grassland. Grass was withered and snow was falling like goose feathers. This year's winter was particularly difficult for the lion men of Toquinen. The failure of the expedition, the endless internal strife, the various clan leaders shirked their responsibilities and argued with each other. Some areas in the south and west were rumored to have fallen into eternal night. Large numbers of cattle and sheep died in the snowstorm, and refugees came from all directions, making the situation even worse. It was as warm as spring in the thick leather tent. A bright flame burned on the matchstick, making a crackling sound. Sparks occasionally rose and climbed up the dark bottom of the pot. A lamb rib was cooking in the pot. A thick layer of oil was bubbling on top of the meat. The air was filled with the aroma of meat mixed with the aroma of plant tubers. Nair's eyes were a little dazed. The way the lion people counted the years was slightly different from other civilizations. Due to the lack of farming culture, they divided the two most important seasons of the year by the withering and flourishing of the plants on the grassland. 1 year passed when the plants on the grassland withered and the other flourished. That seemed to be something that happened not too long ago. It was the season of the year when the vegetation was the most flourishing. The clansmen were in high spirits, and he had just completed his coming-of-age ceremony. He had tied his pure white mane into a hair whip and wholeheartedly wanted to become the greatest warrior of the Lion clan. Just like his ancestors, he wanted to reclaim Toquinen's long-lost honor. At that time, everything seemed to be going in the best direction. But in the blink of an eye they had lost everything. He had lost his childhood playmate, his father, and many other people close to him. The lion beast men of Toquinen, on the other hand, had their spines broken. They could not stand up again. This harsh winter had brought disaster to the clan. The lion man Xiaonan was confused. Toquinen had lost its glory. When would they be able to take it back? Nair. The person beside him reminded him in a low voice. Only then did Nair come back to his senses. The tent was bustling with activity. The leaders of 7 or 8 clans surrounded the 3 humans, their green eyes filled with evil intentions. The atmosphere in the tent was tense. The human knight had his hand on the hilt of his sword, looking alert. The wizard's hand was hidden under his sleeve, holding something. Only the human who claimed to be the envoy had a normal expression on his face under the hood. Nair glanced at them with his pale green eyes. "After my father's death, I don't have much to do now. I just want to lead my people through this difficult winter," the young lion man said. He stood up, the brass rings on his mane clinking against each other. The Toquinen people may have lost their beloved king for a while, but that doesn't mean we have fallen. We will not ally ourselves with the humans. This winter is very cold, the human girl standing in the middle said. Half of her pretty face was exposed under her hood, and she smiled faintly. Tomorrow's winter will be even colder. Can I take it that you're provoking us? Nair frowned. But I won't argue with a woman. You can leave. The young girl raised her head, and everyone felt their hearts skip a beat. Her eyes shone like the stars in the night sky, and they seemed to be able to see through people's hearts. I am the daughter of Duke Diomedes. Do you dare to make a bet with me, Your Highness Nair? What bet? Nair clearly did not want to be looked down upon by a woman. I will convince you. The bet is the future of the Toquinen lionmen. What if you lose? I will marry you. The young lionman's heart skipped a beat. Lionmen's females were slender, and their beauty standards were not that different from humans. But no matter what, he could not deny the beauty of the young girl in front of him. Her eyes were so sharp that they could see through people's hearts. He fell silent at first sight. But he still shook his head. I can't accept this. The young girl did not seem to mind. She glanced at her companion, and the wizard took out an old piece of parchment from under his sleeve. Under everyone's watchful eyes, the wizard carefully unfolded the parchment and placed it in front of the lionmen leaders. When they saw the parchment, the expressions of the lionmen changed. Nair clenched his fists and he felt a rush of blood to his head. His eyes blazed with anger as he glared at the young girl. Her face, which he had thought was pure and beautiful, was now twisted and vicious in his eyes. It was only a crumpled piece of parchment, and it did not seem to be complete. The yellowed, charred and cracked paper was densely filled with words, but in the blank corner, there was a somewhat black claw print. The paw print was torn from the middle, like a mark of humiliation, twisting and turning to separate the history and honor of the lionmen. Under the pressure of the darkness dragon, the Temple of the Earth was the first to withdraw from the sacred covenant. The furious flame King Gretel tore the oath of the Toquinen people in front of the king of the lionmen, and threw it in front of his former best friend. The lionman's hero, the Lion King of the Toquinen people, was too ashamed to face his best friend, and did not have the face to take away his half of the covenant. And so, this eternal shame stayed with Cruz for nearly 1,000 years. This was also the hatred that the lion beast men of Toquinen bore for generations. Their former king was forced by the orders of the Temple of Earth. Not long after the greatest hero in the history of the lion beast men withdrew from the covenant, he died of depression. And Nair's family was the inheritor of that great name. Today, 1,000 years later, we all know the truth, the young girl replied quietly. The Lion King used his own way to end his guilt, but we can't change history. For 1,000 years, the Toquinen people have suffered undeserved condemnation. My father only asked me to return it to you. Nair was stunned. The leaders of the lion men were also stunned. That was the long-lost glory of Toquinen, lying there quietly. He instinctively wanted to reach out and grab it, but it was too difficult. 1,000 years of regret, because of failure and the inferiority of the betrayers, the lion men were trapped in this barren grassland. The wish of countless people night after night made every lion man king want to go back to that moment, even if it meant death, to change Toquinen's fate. But people could not change history. Confusion, inferiority and self-doubt. This was the mentality of many Toquinen people. The tragedy seemed to have been cast from the beginning. A history without heroes was as bleak as an eternal night for a people, because they were the descendants of the betrayers. But the young lion man finally clenched his fists. What do you want? He asked calmly. The pride and honor of a people were not earned by charity. If the ancestors had done wrong, the descendants had to make up for it. The young girl looked up at the lion man king. He was only a young boy, but he already had the bearing of a king. This winter is very cold. Many people will die on the grasslands. She looked at the heavy snow outside the tent. Next winter may be even colder. The food on the grasslands can't feed so many people. We have to abandon the elderly and kill the weak babies. Perhaps only 1 in 10 newborns can grow up in hunger. How many young adults did Toquinen lose this year? How long will it take for them to recover? She looked back and smiled warmly. Your Highness Nair, we only have one request, and that is to escort us out of this grassland. After that, she bowed to the crowd and turned to leave. It was quiet in the tent. There was only the sound of water splashing. Your Highness. The leaders of the lion men whispered. They exchanged glances with each other. Their green eyes were filled with worry, anxiety, and something else. Wait. Nair finally mustered up the courage to stop her. Are you going to Anzaruda? Are you allied with the Hazel people? The young girl stopped and nodded with her back to him. The young lion man seemed to have made up his mind. He turned back to his men and said, "Take those things out." There was silence in the tent. The servants brought in a box and carefully placed the contents of the box on the short table, connecting it with the torn parchment. It was the torn treaty of alliance that the lion-beast men had found over the past hundreds of years. These fragments seemed to symbolize the obsession of the Toquinen people. They carefully collected it as if one day they could recover their long-lost glory from these fragments. But at this moment all of this seemed to be a little trivial. Soon, a crumpled and broken piece of parchment appeared on the low table. It was about a quarter to a fifth of its original size. The broken dark red claw print was scattered on the fragments. Nair glanced at the young girl. He walked forward and used his claws to cut open a wound on his palm. Then he let his blood drip onto the black and dried claw mark. The rose-red blood dripped down, and in the bright light, the old and new blood seemed to gradually merge at this moment. Lionmen of Toquinen, fulfill your promise once more. What we failed to do 1,000 years ago, we will make up for 1,000 times today. We will go with you, to finish this war. Just as described in the Pale poem. What is that place? Ariel. Breton looked at the sparks in the sky. Black smoke rose from the plains. Even though the stars were faintly discernible and the sky was getting dark, they were still clearly visible. Ariel was an important town in Covardo, second only to the king's city. The sparks of fire there proved that there was still a battle in Covardo. The White Lion Legion had not completely fallen. The three of them stood on the mountain path, their eyes reflecting the sparks as they silently watched the scene. The accompanying night was also silent. Although they were all injured, the scene in front of them had already made them forget their pain. The kingdom was in a sea of fire. This was their shame. Everyone secretly clenched their teeth. "Is that your city?" a somewhat muffled voice asked. It was an old dwarf, arrogantly sitting on the back of a heavily armored mountain goat. He held a warhammer in his hand and squinted his small eyes as he muttered to himself. Breton turned around and looked at him strangely. How many years had it been since he had seen the dwarves on the surface? To the north of the Misty Mountain Range, there was indeed a small path that led underground. This ancient path passed through the mountains, through deep valleys and ancient forests, through rubble and weathered colossi, and finally reached the entrance of an ancient passage. Many years ago, the mountain dwarves had controlled the entrance of the underground passage, guarding the door to the underworld. They built halls deep in the mountains. These halls were intricately connected and formed the Dwarven city. When the Dwarven kingdom was at its most prosperous, they had even built a huge empire. But with the decline of the Argent clan, the Rune dwarves and the Argent plains disappeared. The dwarves' glory was gone, and the empire fell apart, leaving behind countless ruins in the darkness of the underground. In the War of the Holy Saints, the dwarves of the Chong Mountain tribe betrayed the allied forces of the humans and elves. From then on they were rarely seen in the surface world. First of all, they had seen the crystal monsters in Count Yenbao's territory, and then there was the terrifying existence that the rebels called the No Race. Every time they encountered them they suffered heavy losses. After entering the Misty Mountains, they had sacrificed dozens of White Lion Knight along the way to reach here. If it were not for the sudden appearance of these strange dwarves, all of them would have died here. Manrique did not forget that those terrifying monsters were under the hammers of these dwarves. One hammer strike, one kill. It was as simple as smashing watermelons. "Why are those crystal clusters chasing you?" the dwarf asked again. Manrique was stunned. Dilfrey and Breton looked at each other and asked softly, "Are you talking about those monsters?" "Yes, crystal clusters." The old dwarf looked at the countess and said, "Little girl, you don't understand how terrifying they are. I have seen them crystallized with my own eyes. There was no life there." Dilfrey had never thought that those monsters would be so terrifying. She recalled the scene in Count Yenbao's territory, and her fingers turned white. Breton saw that she did not look too good, so he took the initiative to stand up and retold the whole story. "This is Erwin?" the old dwarf suddenly asked. Breton was stunned and nodded. "You're in luck." The old dwarf nodded and looked at Dilfrey carefully. He said that you are the daughter of Count Yenbao. You are called Dilfrey? Is your ancestor the son of the Flame family Knight Sola? You are from the Swordkeeper family, right? He looked at the box that the countess was hugging tightly and said, "This is the sacred sword Mither. Don't worry, we will help you bring it to where it should go. Dilfrey was stunned. She opened her eyes wide and looked at the old dwarf. She even forgot to breathe. At the side there was a commotion. The human knight pulled out their swords and looked at the dwarves vigilantly. Breton and Manrique also stood in front of Dilfrey. Breton pulled out his sword, while Manrique took out a gun from his pocket. What do you want? The young captain asked nervously. But the old dwarf did not even look at him. He turned his head and ordered a dwarven knight behind him, blow the horn. Do you see that place? He pointed in the direction of Corvado, where flames were soaring into the sky. Let's go there. It's called Ariel. I asked before. The dwarven knight nodded and immediately took the horn from his waist. But before he could lift the horn with both hands, Dilfrey's voice finally reached him. Who are you? The old dwarf put on his helmet and turned around. He answered in a low voice, You can call me Caliphon or the Griffin King. In the name of Aaron's sacred anvil for the Silver Plains, the dwarven heavy cavalry shouted in unison. Woo, the horn blew. Chapter 1505. Marshall stared at the forest on the hillside. The forest made the Sapphire Mountains appear dark in winter. A group of patrolling soldiers slowly slid down from the forest on the hillside. Only a few of them had intact armor, but their battle robes were tattered and hung on their bodies like rags. Some of them used sharpened wooden sticks as weapons and everyone looked hungry. He lowered his head and silently wiped his long sword. The blade was already curled. The reason it was not broken was that every White Lion Knight in Tonajil was equipped with the best equipment, refined armor and swords that could only be produced on a small scale in handmade workshops. Especially the weapons purchased in batches before 776, they were all of the highest standards set by the merchant lady. They were the finest products produced by the master craftsman in Hazel. The ragged cotton armor of the noble soldiers could not even withstand a single strike from the golden-haired knight, and the armor of the Lord's knights could only take a few more hits. Sometimes even the armor-piercing awl could not be used. He still remembered the look of shock and fear on the golden-haired knight's face during the first battle. But superior equipment could not determine the outcome of a battle with a great disparity in strength. The army of Grimoires had formed layers of blockade in the south. There were thousands of them, and there were also the gargoyles and iron men of the Saussels. The White Lion Guards and the Valkyries protected the princess. Day after day they were forced to the Sapphire Mountains. There was no food in the mountains to support an army, especially in winter. Even if there were only a few hundred of them, the rebels wanted to trap them alive. Marshall chewed on a piece of hard grass root, which was the last of his food reserves. As for the specifics, he could not remember when he had last eaten. His brain was a little numb from the cold. The last meal was when he shared a roasted mountain rat with his colleagues, but he had forgotten when it was. But food was getting harder and harder to find. The patrolling soldiers were not so much on guard but looking for food. A few hundred people crossing the mountain forest was like a disaster. They even had to dig a layer of the frozen soil to look for hibernating animals. If not for the poisonous bark of the sapphire trees, they could also be used to make soup. He remembered the first few bloody battles. Both sides had tried their best to knock each other down, but the nobles had retreated after paying a terrible price. They had chosen to surround the enemy instead of attacking. In the first battle, he remembered that he had killed 3 people and was covered in wounds. Later on, the more he killed, the fewer wounds he had. In the end, there was no one for him to kill. The other party stopped attacking. Sometimes, he thought that it would have been better if he had died in those bloody battles so that he wouldn't have to suffer. He was one of the 3rd batch of White Lion Knights. This was also the last batch of White Lion Knights trained by Tonajil before the war. He was a native of Tonajil, born as a commoner. When he was selected, his results were neither good nor bad. However, 3 days ago he replaced his captain and became a great knight. In Erewhon, this step meant that one would become a true noble and one would become a baron. However, this was meaningless because no one knew if they could survive the next battle, just like the person he replaced. Marshall didn't have any regrets. He was not the eldest son. Before the Second Tonajil War, his shoemaker father had kicked him into the army camp and told him to stand up like a real man to protect what was really worth protecting. However, he did not make it in time for the war because the war ended in the first week he entered the army camp. During the Battle of Ampere Seal, he was selected to join the White Lion Guards. In a sense, this was considered a success. However, he only felt a little regretful. The White Lion Guards would not admit defeat so easily. It was like a pride of lions that had lost their Lion King. If the Lion King was still around, they would not have ended up like this. Marshall gently put down the rag. The curved blade of the sword shone brightly in the cold winter air. A handsome face was reflected on the blade that was as bright as a pool of dim light. That face had a very serious expression. The young knight was slightly stunned because that face was not his own. He raised his head in astonishment, and a tall shadow cast over him. With a clang, his sword fell to the ground. Now, the Lion King was back. The eldest princess' face was pale as she leaned against a cushion. Her silver pupils revealed a deep contemplation. She had been injured and was so weak that she was almost boneless. Her originally slender hand was now even more clearly visible. Under her almost transparent skin, the blue veins quietly flowed. There was a sickly beauty to it. There was a small gap in the tent door, and bright light flowed in from the outside and fell on her body. She stubbornly sat up straight, and with both hands grasping her sword, she stared in that direction for a long time. Freya could not help but feel sorry for her. Last night, Brunhilde told her that the princess was in so much pain that she broke out in a cold sweat in her sleep. Her clothes were soaked in sweat, but she did not make a sound when she woke up, as if the wound had completely healed. "Eat something, Your Highness." She could not help but persuade her again. "What about you?" Griffin turned and asked. "I've eaten." Freya quickly replied, "The soldiers found some chickadees." She could not continue because the princess was looking at her with a half-smile. She pointed at the food on the plate. "The chickadees have all gone to the south of Chablis in winter. This is chicken just like what you gave me yesterday. You said you found a turtle dove yesterday and we each ate half of it. Is this the other half that you were supposed to eat?" "Your Highness, Griffin shook her head. "Freya, I can eat the Roman lady's unprofitable business no matter how long it takes. To think that she gave it to the soldiers as rations. This chicken tastes like dried wood that has been stored for a year. Didn't anyone tell you about it?" She blinked her eyes playfully on her pale face. "As a princess I'm very picky. Although you're Everton's daughter, you might never understand the life of a noble since you were born as a commoner." The knight's face turned red after being exposed. She wondered if her brain was not working properly. Otherwise, why couldn't she do something as simple as telling a lie? But the smile on Griffin's face disappeared. Even in such a weak state, she still exuded a dignified aura. She frowned and said, "Freya, did you secretly save your rations for me? But I'm not like you, Your Highness." Freya quickly defended herself. Griffin raised her head and looked at her. "You're my commander, silly girl." She stretched out her hand and stroked the sword lightly. "We've already found out that Amandina went to the lighthouse after leaving Magiton. If we move closer to Grenoir's, we'll have a chance to save her. If I can't recover from my injuries, you'll take my sword and represent my will. You must save her." "Your Highness." Griffin raised her hand. "This is also for the war in Tonagel, Freya, and I can't let Mr. Brando down." She gently closed her eyes, her long eyelashes trembling slightly, and her voice lowered. "I don't want to leave any regrets. Do you understand, Freya? I don't want to let everyone down. Just like my father, he owes you Butchie an apology. He is him and you are you." Freya's chest heaved up and down. "Everyone in Butchie curses your father, saying that he's a fatuous ruler, but he has a good daughter. For you, we're even willing to forgive your father's mistakes. Because we only hope that Your Highness can live well, and one day, under her watch, everything in this kingdom will become better than before." Griffin's eyes were a little red and she smiled. "Don't worry, I won't give up so easily. Even in the darkest moment, I've never been defeated. I'm Halifa's daughter, and the blood of the Holy King flows in my body. No one can defeat me, not even death." Her words suddenly stopped. Her silver eyes were a little frozen. Freya was just about to say something, but a slender hand was already placed on her shoulder. Freya almost froze. She clearly felt someone enter the tent, but she thought it was Brunhilde because the Valkyries didn't report. But as soon as she felt the familiar warmth of the hand on her shoulder, she immediately understood that, who's back? The strong female knight's eyes were immediately covered with a layer of water. Her eyes were as red as a rabbit's, and when she turned her head, tears burst out of her eyes. She wanted to tell the person in front of her how difficult their situation was. She wanted to tell this person how worried she was about the war in Tonagel. She wanted to tell him that Amandina had been taken away by those people, and she didn't know if she was alive or dead. She wanted to cry out loud just like a child. But duty made her stand in place and she still let the tears flow down her face. She looked at the familiar face in front of her with teary eyes. Brando looked at the crying Valkyrie with some heartache. He never thought that the flag of Aween in his memory would one day be helpless in front of him, like a child without feet. Strong and firm, weak and slender, the moment when the two different kinds of beauty intersected, it deeply touched the softest part of his heart. But the princess was still at the side, and Brando could only gently wipe away the tears on the Valkyrie's face. "I'm sorry ladies, I'm late. But in my opinion it's always just right," the princess replied with a faint smile. In the narrow tent, the two of them looked at each other in silence. One of them stood. One of them sat on the bed. Freya suddenly understood that he and the princess might have a lot to talk about. Her tears were still wet, and she hugged Brando tightly, secretly holding his hand. Brando understood what she meant, and he sighed in his heart at this kind girl. He smiled at her and nodded. I'm going to see Miss Brunhilde. She might have something to ask me." Miss Knight found a poor excuse and turned to leave. When the two of them passed by each other, Brando whispered in her ear, "There's food outside, I brought some supplies for you." Freya's face turned red and she ran away without looking back. Princess Griffin watched the interaction between the two of them with an astute attitude. Her eyes were bright and she smiled slightly, but she was actually a little concerned. "No one can defeat you, not even death, your highness?" Brando looked at his princess. "Because they can't reach you at all. Your knight is in front of you and no one can do it without my permission." "No one can do it with your permission," Princess Griffin added. "Mr. Knight, you seem to have experienced a lot." "Yes, is there a hint of vicissitudes?" "No." After saying this, even though she was very weak, she couldn't help but laugh. Brando also felt the change in the princess. She had become more mature. Perhaps this was the real her, and gradually overlapped with the shadow in his memory. He took out the angel's heart bottle and motioned for her to drink, but the elven girl was unmoved and only looked at him with expectant eyes. Brando was stunned, and then his heart jumped slightly. He helped the weak girl up and the two of them snuggled in an ambiguous way. The fairy princess looked at him with trust. Brando's heart beat a little faster as he lowered the angel's heart bottle and dripped a drop of the glowing liquid on the tip of her slender tongue. The princess swallowed it, and the majestic vitality contained in the liquid immediately began to work. Her withered limbs became plump again, and her skin became white and delicate. Her silver eyes became brighter little by little, and her cheeks became healthy and rosy. Her scattered silver hair glowed with a dazzling brilliance. It was like a withered flower once again began to bloom in life. Griffin looked at this incredible scene in shock. She didn't even care when the serious injuries on her body were completely healed. This is the angel's heart bottle. That is the holy artifact formed by the blood of angels?" Brando nodded. The princess seemed to be lost in thought. "I owe you even more, my Mr. Knight." "I'm just worried that the princess still hates me," Brando replied helplessly. "Let's call it even." Princess Griffin raised her head in embarrassment. "Don't talk about that." But the memory that made her embarrassed and angry was now a little sweet. This topic made the half-elf girl feel a little embarrassed, and she slightly moved away from his arms. Although Brando was a little disappointed, he also understood that the princess' actions today had already proved her trust in him. He couldn't go too far, and the distance between the two of them just now had already made him a little embarrassed. Princess Griffin calmed down first, and began to describe what happened after he left. Some of these things were already heard by Brando, but when it came from the princess' mouth, it was a different feeling. When Brando heard the part about Erwin's country, the ambiguous atmosphere in the tent had already faded to almost nothing. After a long narration, Princess Griffin suddenly stopped and then asked, "Can you tell me about the Cisaldians?" This topic seemed to have opened a Pandora's box, and the tent suddenly fell silent. Brando looked at her in surprise. He originally thought that the princess wouldn't take the initiative to mention it. After thinking for a while, he didn't have much preparation in his heart, so he simply told her everything that happened after he left Erwin, and finally mentioned the Cisaldians. He did this to avoid embarrassment for the princess. The elven girl obviously understood this and she felt a little warm in her heart. About Brando's trip she actually knew a little from other sources, but after all, it wasn't so detailed and there were several times when she was entranced. She was a good listener, and her good upbringing prevented her from showing subconscious tiredness at any time. Moreover, Brando's narration was fascinating, and there were a few times when the princess exclaimed softly. But when he reached the last part, Princess Griffin's expression turned cold. She didn't expect that so many major events had already happened in this world, and yet the nobles of Erwin were still arguing endlessly over trivial matters. They didn't even hesitate to disturb the kingdom, colluding with outsiders and evil cultists. What a laughable joke. Perhaps in the eyes of outsiders, this ancient kingdom was simply an abandoned child that couldn't be saved. When Brando finished his last sentence, the tent fell silent again. Both of them lowered their heads as if they were thinking about something, and the air was filled with an aura of silence. After a long time, Princess Griffin said faintly, "So at least many people in the royal faction knew from the beginning that the Twilight Dragon was behind the Cisaldians?" Brando nodded silently. Princess Griffin was expressionless. She seemed to be weighing something in her heart, but when she finally opened her mouth, it took her a lot of effort to say, "The ancient nobles and their noble beliefs created this kingdom. Erwin has never forgotten those who fought to change its fate, but history is always changing, and some people are indeed no longer so suitable." Brando looked at her hands that were clenched into fists. Her knuckles were obviously white and they were even trembling slightly. She was born in the flourishing era and had witnessed the best spirit of this kingdom. But she had also witnessed her father die under cold-blooded politics. She hated this outdated system more than anyone else, but she also had a rare warmth in her heart. However, at this very moment, with just one sentence, she had ended the lives of countless people, including those who had worked with her before, those who had supported her, her friends, and even her maternal grandfather, the relative who had reached out to her when she was in a desperate situation. But if the history of a kingdom could not move forward in a pool of blood, then it could only turn to dust in the flames. Brendel wanted to comfort the weak girl, but he said, "Don't worry. It's not enough." Princess Griffin raised her head and stared at him coldly with her silver eyes. "This time, Your Highness, don't forget that I'm also on the opposite side of you." The princess took a deep breath as if she had already made a great decision. "I'll marry you and we have a marriage contract. In the future you can—" Brando smiled bitterly. Although it was also a political marriage, he felt a little warm in his heart. At least he understood that in her heart, his position could even be on par with her ideals and beliefs. He looked at the princess, but he did not want to see her softening at this time. He did not know whether he should be happy or angry, but he still shook his head because that was not what he wanted. "Haruz is the king of this kingdom, Your Highness. If we want to give Erwin the brightest future, we must give him the most legitimate status." The tent fell into a dead silence. After a long time, Princess Griffin raised her head and looked at him with some resentment. "Very well, as you wish, I will execute you, the Count of Randner and Tonagel, the Lord of Abes, and the great hero of Erwin in public, for blasphemy against the members of the royal family and disregard for the central government." Brando scratched his head embarrassedly. Stop, I'm not that great, Your Highness. In fact, there is a relatively gentler way. Maybe I will leave Erwin. Next, Erwin will also participate in the war with the Twilight Dragon. I believe that Tonagel and Valhalla will be the backbone of this war. I entrust it to you and I hope you can use it well. Why should Erwin listen to your command? Do you mean that Haruz and I are just puppets under your control? Princess Griffin's face was expressionless, and she changed her tone into a cold one. "Unfortunately, after you left, Aween turned to the embrace of the Twilight Dragon. Anyway, its selfish princess and king only care about their own people. As for the great responsibility of saving the world, I'm afraid the people of Aween are unable to shoulder it." Brando knew that he had offended the princess and did not know whether to laugh or cry for a while. But after a while he heard Princess Griffin ask faintly, "Where are you going?" "Maybe I have to settle the score with the Bugas first, then Saint Tassol?" He wanted to continue, but Princess Griffin interrupted him. "At least before you leave, Mr. Knight, can you hug me again?" Brando was stunned. He looked up, and Princess Griffin's slender neck was slowly dyed red, and her blush was extremely cute. She tilted her head slightly and did not look at him. Brando opened his mouth and he wanted to say no, but found that his body was not under his control at all. He felt his heart beating very fast, and he slowly and gently knelt in front of the princess. He did not even dare to look into her eyes. He just gently took Griffin into his arms and felt that the half-elf girl's weight was as light as a feather. Princess Griffin curled up motionlessly in his arms, tenderly listening to her knight's strong and powerful heartbeat. She whispered, "I'm sorry if I accidentally diluted the position of the Roman lady in your heart, but I was also your fiancé, wasn't I? What else could make one's heart soften more than a strong and proud princess lowering herself to whisper sweet nothings into one's ear?" But just as she said, other than blaming himself, what else could he say? "I'm sorry, I can't say those 3 words easily because I have a responsibility to this kingdom, because I've already promised the kingdom, it's difficult to promise the king." Brendel listened quietly to the princess's story. "I have one last request," Princess Griffin said in a soft voice. "Mr. Knight." She looked up at him. "Please be sure to bring back Miss Amandina." Brando nodded seriously. Because this was not a promise, but an agreement between two ladies. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.